You're listening to Coding Blocks, episode 78. Subscribe to us and leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app.
And check us out at codingblocks.net where you can find show notes, examples, discussion, and more.
Send your feedbacks, questions, and rants to comments at codingblocks.net. Follow us on Twitter at codingblocks or head to www.codingblocks.net and find all our social links there at the top of the page. With that, I'm Alan Underwood.
I'm Joe Zach.
And I'm Michael Outlaw.
All right, so on this episode, we've got our friend Will Madison. I am Will Madison on Twitter on the show to talk about, deliberate practice for programmers. So this is the first time we've done this, and, hopefully the guest thing goes well. And, welcome, Will.
Thanks, man. Appreciate y'all having me on, dude. I listen all the time. It's just awesome to be on the show this time.
That's excellent. Will's one of our buddies that we worked with a few years back, and just an awesome guy, knows his stuff. And unlike us, he's not in love with the .NET side of things. He comes from a different perspective. So, maybe you'll get a little bit of that on the show here.
So for all of our Java developers out there, Will be here to make sure that they get fair representation.
That's right.
I'm really here for all the gophers in the world.
Gophers. You did Dart at one point, right?
No Dart. I did some Kotlin stuff, though.
Okay, yeah. So
if you're already part of our Slack community, you've probably had some interactions with Will, or you've seen some of his interactions in the Slack community. He's an active member. And if you're not on the Slack channel and you haven't seen him, then you need to join. Go to www.codingblocks.net/Slack and sign yourself up.
Awesome. And as we like to do every show, we like to go over our reviews. We didn't put any names beside these, so I'm taking iTunes this time. And somebody can figure out Stitcher for the next one. All right. Excellent. All right. So for iTunes, we got Pete O'Shea. We've got No Ops or No PC Buzzwords. Montemer, Buster in Dallas, Mr. Bimble, Hey Dixon, Oren 0007, Channel Z13, Ram Kasyap, Virtua Boza, Sravan Kumar Kilaru, I believe, was all of them.
Man, he's so good with those names.
No, dude, you want to know the funny thing is? I met some people out at MVP Summit from Croatia. No, dude. So let me give you a little clue.
Wait a minute. You got tripped up once in your life. For the first time in your life, Alan got tripped. I can meet someone from Alabama and be like, what? And they're born and raised in Alabama, and I wouldn't know how to pronounce their name.
Yeah, man. The thing that got me on the Croatian thing is they pronounce every single letter. Every letter. So it doesn't matter how long it is. Everyone has its own individual sound, and it threw me off, man. Like I was trying to do it, and the guy's like, "Look, dude, you're never gonna get out. Just give up." All right, I give. So yes, thank you guys that did the reviews there.
Yeah, and I actually just got to meet Virtua Boza last week, so I apologize for spelling your name wrong initially, but thanks for the review. And now I'm going to read this review. So thank you big time to Licka-O, Lean Web Start, Mains, Tactical Penguin, and Super Good Dave. We really appreciate it.
Definitely. And now, I think I've been listening to a lot more podcasts this week than I have been in recent time. I don't know why, but there was a lot of cool stuff that came out of it, both from Twitter and different podcasts. So the first one is, and I'm curious what you guys think about this. So on Security Now with Steve Gibson, a podcast that I know Mike loves, and I don't know if you other guys listen to it.
We've actually mentioned it as a tip of the week in one of the early episodes.
I mean, he's really good. He goes deep on things. Sometimes it's a little bit too much, sometimes not enough. I mean, but whatever. This one, it was the episode where he was talking about, and I haven't even got to this part yet. What's it called? I can't even think
WebAssembly?
WebAssembly. Thank you. But the interesting thing is, in there, we've heard of Troy Hunt, the guy who has the haveyoubeenpwned.com, right? The thing where has your password leaked out and your username leaked out on one of the hacks online, right? Well, one of the things that he talked about in this episode that kind of threw me off, and I don't know that I love, is that CloudFlare is a CDN that you can plug into your website, and basically instead of your site being hit directly, it'll always proxy through CloudFlare, right? And it's for security purposes, it's for speed purposes, it's for all kinds of things, which is a really cool service considering it's free for the most part. You can get an enterprise plan or whatever. But this is the part that bugged me. And it was shocking to me that Steve Gibson was really excited about it. So here's what they're doing right now. And it's a neat idea. Let's say that you go to log into your site. You've got your site set up with Cloudflare. When you submit your form to log in, it's going to see if, hey, did you submit a password? And if you did, it's now going to make a request out to the Have You Been Pwned API to find out if your password might have been suspect at some point, like it had been hijacked. And they're going to insert a header into the content of the data that's coming across the pipe. So if on your site you decided you wanted to take a look and see if that header's alive there, then you could say, oh, by the way, we see that, Cloudflare sees that you have a password that exists out there on the web somewhere. Do you want to do something about it? And to me, that's kind of scary, right? Like it exposes the fact that your data isn't safe. Right? Like there's this man in the middle that can kind of look at things that are going back and forth, and you hope that Cloudflare is not doing anything bad with it.
Well, I mean, let's be clear. In this particular scenario, you are the user of the site.
Yes.
So you might be registering for a site. Maybe Alan has a site, a new e-commerce site, and you're going to set up an account on it, and you're going to log in. And Alan's site is hosted on Cloudflare, and because we live in a world, post Snowden, it's on, he's got a SSL certificate on it, and he's hosted on Cloudflare for CDN reasons to distribute some of that traffic. And so Cloudflare has to have the cert. They need to have the certificate in order for that to work, in order for them to be able to, relay that content for you. And so they're already the man in the middle. You've purposely made them the man in the middle, right? You consciously made them the man in the middle. So I feel like that's okay. And then when you, the user, log into Alan's brand new e-commerce site, that call, they recognize that you're logging in. They see the username password coming through. And so they make a call out to Troy Hunt's site. And then if there is, if that user ID password is in there, then they will add a CF password pwned header to the call, and then that is what ultimately makes it back to you, to Alan's server, right, with the header CF password.
But does that not feel dirty to you guys at all? Like that sort of scares me.
I think it's awesome.
I don't know, man.
Yes, I feel both ways. Like it's definitely a good thing. I feel like they're in a good position to do that sort of thing on a large scale. But at the same time, I don't really like the idea of being reminded that they have this kind of power. But I don't think anything's really changed other than we're more aware of it. So
right.
Well, okay. It seems like both of you might be getting tripped up on the fact that Cloudflare is doing this, right, as a convenience to their users. But you could do it on your own. Like if Alan wasn't hosted on a CDN in this example e-commerce site that I made up for Alan, which by the way, get that up and running. He could make this same API call himself.
You could. And I guess that's my thing is when you make that conscious decision in your application on your own, that's fine. But this almost feels like there was the whole uproar about like when Comcast and Verizon and those guys were inspecting packets that were coming across the wire, right? And they were changing things and they were trying to inject their own trackers and stuff.
That's different.
I feel like this is getting into sort of that, I hired you to be my CDN. I didn't hire you to be my babysitter type thing, right? I don't know, man. Like, I don't know. Well, what do you think?
The only thing I was going to say, what will make it whack is if this is one of those things where they snuck it into like the end user license agreement and didn't send you a deliberate email saying, hey, by the way, as a convenience, we're going to be doing this extra thing. Like that would be whack if they did that. Otherwise, I think it's actually pretty neat.
So some form of an opt-in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even in the Cloudflare configuration.
Yeah.
You have to I want this. I like this. Have I been owned? Have I been pwned?
And let's be clear, I don't think they're doing anything nefarious, right? Like, I don't think they're like, I honestly believe that Cloudflare is usually looking out for guys trying to be the good guy and help protect sites and all that kind of thing. But it was shocking to me that Steve Gibson was all excited about it. I'm like, dude, like you're always talking about man in the middle stuff. And this is something that they just kind of did.
But I mean, usually when we talk about a man in the middle attack or anything like that, like it's because you didn't know the man in the middle. But in the case of Cloudflare, you had to consciously make them the man in the middle
to serve
for
up
your website.
To serve up your content, not
Yes.
to modify your content, right? Like they're
They're just adding a header.
that's modifying your content. I mean, I'm just saying. Again,
That's a pretty weak one, though.
Again, I don't think it's a huge bad deal, but it was a little interesting.
I mean, the
to me.
Verizon one that you're talking about, I mean, like they were adding JavaScript and HTML to the payload that was being delivered to the client.
Right.
That is
I know it's not
different.
the same level, but again, just an interesting thing. So definitely we'll have a link to that particular show in the show notes here. Another one. So Super Good Dave, who left us a review this time. Thank you. We've been chatting in Slack because our Slack channels are awesome. And we've been hanging out in the Gear channel, and the upcoming Intel 8th generation processors with the AMD Vega graphics chips are soon to come out. And those things are supposed to be on par with the NVIDIA GTX 1050, like somewhere in between the 1050 and the 1060. So that should be hitting pretty soon. Both Dell and HP have some pretty decent offerings coming up. So we're both waiting and keeping our fingers crossed for that. So,
do you know when? Like, should I hold off buying a laptop if I was thinking about buying one in the next 3 months?
So it was supposed to happen in March. Now, I don't know if this whole meltdown thing that happened with Intel and AMD, by the way, also had some bad stuff happen with Ryzen recently.
Rise and fall.
Yeah, Rise and Fall. So I don't know if it's because of that. They're trying to fix some of these things before they go out full market, but I would imagine here probably within the next 30 to 60 days, these things should be hitting because it was already supposed to be on the market. So, and I think some of the Dells, they're not up for pre-order either. I was looking at those earlier. So as soon as we get some solid information, we'll put links on that.
I mean, good. I hope so, because I need to mine some Bitcoin on the go. So I need as good a graphics card to my laptop as I can get.
You heard that they hacked Tesla, right? And they found an open Kubernetes thing from Tesla, and they actually had some of the Teslas out there doing mining.
The car.
I believe.
People were driving around.
Yeah.
Mining
and then it was
Bitcoin.
found. Yeah. I don't know if it was the actual cars or what, but they definitely had a Kubernetes thing that wasn't password protected and it was hijacked. It was on the same episode that they were talking about the WebAssembly stuff. So that one was packed full of cool information. This
Welcome
next
to 2018, no flying cars, but they're mining Bitcoin.
That's right.
I heard a story about Fave Icons hacking some sort of doing some sort of nefarious mining. It's crazy times.
It's ridiculous, man. All right, so some really cool news that I just saw on Twitter, and actually, Six Figure Dev, they are the ones that shared this out. They just released information about Windows Server 2019, and that's going to come built in with Kubernetes and Linux support. Times is a changing for Microsoft. That is amazing. So building it in Google and Linux, right? Like that's pretty cool stuff. Let's see. We'll have a link to that as well. And then, so another thing related to just really cool stuff happening. I love Docker. One of the things that's been frustrating on Windows is typically if you wanted to run a Windows Docker container, then you had to go down there to your little whale thing and say, hey, use Windows containers, right? And
whale thing.
Your whale thing, the guy that's shooting some water out the top of them, right? But if you wanted to use, let's say, Alpine or some other Linux container, then you'd have to go down there, click the little whale thing and say, switch to Linux containers, which is cool that you could do that on Windows, but it was always a little frustrating that oh man, I can't run my SQL Server developer container next to my Elasticsearch container, right? Now you can. So with the latest release that just hit like a day or two ago, they now have the ability to run, and I think I put the acronym up here. It's called LCOW.
Yeah, we got to come up. We need to go ahead and solidify a proper way to pronounce this now.
LCOW?
Little cow.
Little cow.
I propose little cow.
I like it. All right, so Little Cow, that's Linux containers on Windows. You can now run them side by side. So I don't know how fully baked and fully featured and how well this works yet because I haven't had a chance to play with it, but that's truly exciting. Like, hey, man, pull down whatever you want from Docker Hub and run it. Just, you have one configuration and you go. So that's really cool. All right. And then the last bit of news, seeing as though it seems like I've taken over this section today, is I've heard about blockchain. I invest in some cryptocurrencies, and I like to watch my money flush down the toilet. So that's that's fun, right? Which I think Will also does some bit mining and some investing. So maybe we'll get his thoughts on this. But I never truly really knew what blockchain was. I'd heard about it, and I'd never really taken the time to look into it. And I've always heard, it could change the world. It could, it totally change the way that you do things. And I was like, really? Like, I mean, Bitcoin's like, okay, it's not regular money, but fine, whatever. I listened to the MS Dev show where they had a guy on who was talking about blockchain, who works on the blockchain project for Azure. And it was an awesome episode because in a nutshell, what I learned was the whole purpose of blockchain is really just having a live ledger, right? Let's a distributed live ledger so that
lots of ledgers.
Yeah, lots of them. So that basically you can't just go put something in because it's not going to be validated, right? Like this whole bit mining thing, and I didn't know any of this stuff, is really, somebody's going to solve this problem, and then that's going to get put on something, and then the problem is going to be easy for other people to solve to verify that that was a legit answer, right? So the part that was interesting was this. All right, that all makes perfect sense for the bit mining and the financial aspect of things, right? What didn't make sense to me was when people were talking about different industries. And this is where I thought things were really cool is think about something, ice cream. If you're going to be, you decided to start your own ice cream business, let's call it Madison's Ice Creams, right? Madison's Best Ice Creams. When you ship these things from point A to point B, that stuff has to stay refrigerated at a particular temperature or below, right? Because if it gets above it, then you could get listeria, you could get all kinds of bacteria and problems, right? And how do you verify that? You typically can't, right? You just trust that the refrigerated truck that you put it on is going to be proper from point A to point B. Now you put an IoT device in there, right? With the packages of ice cream, when it gets shipped, that thing's constantly monitoring the temperature. And so now you have this ledger from the time that it left your shop to the time it arrived at the grocery store. And it can be proven that, hey, the temperature was, 35 degrees here or 30, obviously below 35, but probably 32, 31, whatever. And now you'll know if there's a bump in it and you'll be able to say, hey, there was a problem on that refrigerated truck. We can't put these things on the shelf because it could be a health hazard, right? So that was an interesting take to me on a real life problem other than cryptocurrency or something like that, right? Like, where does this stuff actually fit in? So that was really neat, right? And the way the guy put it, and I can't remember his name, I should probably look it up, but the way the guy put it was the blockchain is for when you can't fully trust the information coming from another source, right? Like it doesn't make sense to use blockchain internally in your company typically because you got to jump through a bunch of hoops to make it happen. But when you need to verify an outside party, then it's really cool. So at any rate, man, I highly recommend listening to that episode. I literally just did a tiny summary, but he goes into all kinds of cool stuff. So good stuff. Oh, and then I guess the last thing is I'm going to talk the entire episode. The last thing here is
this where we say this is your favorite part of the show?
No, not typically. Usually we have news from everybody, right? I guess I was the one listening and reading stuff this week. So no, the last thing is we've mentioned it before. If you guys are, go check out codingblocks.net/resources. We have books up there. We have things like Pluralsight and all that kind of stuff. So anything that we find extremely valuable that we use to learn and we share with you guys to learn, we'll have on that page. So if you sign up for it, it's not going to cost you anything extra. As a matter of fact, it might even come at a discount. But, if you plan on buying any of those things, please do check that out and, go from there.
All right, and on to the show topic. Today we're talking about deliberate practice. And recently I did a talk at Orlando Code Camp, and I know you guys up in Georgia are just devastated that you had to miss it. I know a lot of listeners out there are just heartbroken about this, and so I wanted to bring a little bit back and do it on the show here, so you didn't have to miss the whole thing.
But wait, before you go on, you asked a lot of people to come up and kick you in the shin. Did that happen?
No, there was luckily a kind of a podium, and I had a laser pointer. So there were a couple of people I suspected they got that look in their eye like they might be kicking, so I made sure to blind them.
Oh, that's nice.
Yep.
Well, it's either that or should we be disappointed that no one made enough of an effort to actually kick you in the shit?
Right.
I also had a table full of stickers in front of me.
Oh,
so I
well,
think
that
that
probably
kind of
did.
helped distract.
I think the problem is when you see Joe in life, he's way bigger than what you think he might be. It's kind of like Will, right? Like the first time you meet Will, you're like, okay, yeah, I'm going to be real nice to this guy.
As long as the spacing is good in your code, we're gonna be all right.
That's actually what we're talking about today is tabs versus spaces. So.
Oh boy.
Yeah, that's all what deliberate practice is all about. Practicing how you space your code.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, you can make an argument for that. Actually, a big part of the reason I wanted to do the talk was because of the podcast. And thanks to the podcast and really because of the Slack, I've gotten to interact with a lot of people from a lot of different diverse backgrounds and different countries and different stages in their career, different programming languages. And we kind of talk a lot on the show about like what kind of brings us together, you know, like who are these people and why are we able to communicate? Like what is it that we have in common? And what I've kind of come around to thinking about is basically thinking that the people listening to the show or going to the Slack, they have a vested interest in being better programmers. And so I've been on this kind of like this journey, reading a couple books and thinking about it and reading some articles, talking to other people about what it means to be a better programmer and how we can get there. And so I pulled together some info from like 5 different books, which we'll have listed on the show notes. And I kind of pulled together the info that I thought made the most sense for software engineers and tried to kind of dump it into one place and distill out the kind of the core of those books that I thought could make the most sense to us. And so I was going to talk it over with you guys, and hopefully we'll have a fun and engaging rowdy show.
As always.
So divide up into 3 pieces. Basically want to talk about what it means to be good. Like what does it mean to be a good and a better programmer, and what deliberate practice is.
That's the answer. If it compiles, you know you are good.
Show's over. All right.
That's right. Semicolons, man. Semicolons.
Oh.
And what deliberate practice is and why researchers say it's the best way to advance bold skills in bold. The best way to advance skills. And then how we can take those lessons and bring it into programming. And I just want to point out before we dive in, I said we've already divin in, that if you go to codingblocks.net/practice, I've got a bunch of resources up there. So you're going to find a lot of other links and some essays and stuff that I wrote while kind of preparing for this talk.
Cool.
So first up, I wanted to ask you guys actually, and maybe we'll start with Will, just kind of put him on the spot. When I say someone's a good programmer, like if I say, hey, my buddy Will's a great programmer, what does that mean to you?
Well, for me, like it means a couple of things. So, like the way I've always looked at it is that it's just like recognizing skill in any other way, right? When I watch Kobe Bryant play basketball, right, like I can tell greatness when I'm watching it. So, like normally, like when you look at somebody's code, you can be like, okay, this person is deliberate. They're intentional about what they're doing. Like they actually care about the craft. And for me, that's sort of what good means, right? Like if I can look at your code and be like, okay, this person has the things lined up right. They like name things with great intention. They didn't just go in here and haphazardly kind of just throw some code together and make it work. That's kind of what good means. And like they're always trying to improve day over day. And you see that progression.
Yeah, I like the idea of improve too, because it kind of says like, well, maybe there's different paths that you've taken to get to this spot. Maybe you've read a lot of books. Maybe you've watched a lot of videos. Maybe you've done a lot of side projects. There are multiple avenues to get there. But kind of the core there is that you care, right? And so because you care, you found some way to get better, and you kept kind of hammering at it until you got to a good spot. Yeah,
I was thinking of my own answer to that, which might be that in the code you can see good practices. So, like an example might be the inclusion of unit tests, in maybe the way some of that stuff is structured, right? Use of interfaces and things like that, like removing away concreteness as much as possible in the places where it's not necessary, things like that.
That sounds like a kind of dedication to discipline there.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of like expanding on what Will was saying, like, when you're looking at someone else's code to be able to define like, well, what does good mean, right? You're kind of seeing those types of things in it, right? It's not, well, this must work and I can't understand it, so they must be better than I am. That's not what I'm looking for.
Man, that's a tough one for me. I'm always that guy that straddles the line between practicality and pretty code. Like I'm always trying to find the balance there. So I know that probably most of the time my code's going to be good, but it's not going to be the most perfect that it could be, because at some point I call the ball, right? Like I'm like, I got to move on from here. But I think for me, and this is why it's such a tough one, because I don't think anybody would ever look at my code and say it's bad. I think for me, a good developer is somebody that I follow along and I understand why they did things, right? Like it may not be the absolute best pattern, but it might be because we don't know the situation that person was in. But when I see obviously bad patterns, I'm like, it's almost like an anti-good programmer to me. Like, I don't think I ever look at anybody and say, I think that's a good programmer. I look at some and I say, wow, that person really needs to improve, or I just don't have a thought, right? Like, I just assume everybody's always striving to be better. And so that's,
I kind of opposite is what you're saying.
It is.
You can more easily point out the bad programmer.
Yes.
But the good programmer, you're like, I just assume you're all good until I see something and we're like, whoa, you're awful.
And typically it's not even, for me, it's not going to be one thing, right? Like it's going to be, you just see this pattern evolve over time where just bad decisions are made, right? Like, I mean, dude, when I first met Joey, like he would give me these 5-page, dissertations on, this is why this exists like this, right? And it was because he was sort of ashamed of what he was presenting to me, but I also understood the reason why that was happening, right? And so that's why I say, like, saying somebody's a good programmer, I think it's just, you almost see it in the way that they approach the problems, because you can almost find your way through the code that way. And I guess that's my take on it.
Yeah, I don't know where I read this quote at, but like just kind of piggybacking on the notion of like a bad developer, I think it said something along the lines of, there's no such thing as like a bad developer. It's more so reasonable developers in a bad situation.
Yes. Yes.
You know what I mean?
But I've seen bad developers. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I've seen some.
Well, I was thinking, like, there's been plenty of times when I've gone through code base and I can say, like, look at that crappy code. I can say this is bad code. But there's not a lot of times I've seen something said, oh, hey, that's good code. And a lot of times I tend to think of good coders versus good code. And maybe that's because I'm only seeing things kind of with the magnifying glass, got my nose down in it. But I definitely think of people as being good programmers. It makes me kind of think of like, what I personally think of as being a good programmer. It probably has to do with kind of a mix of what you guys all said, but also like Alan's really said, like a focused on kind of pragmatism and what they did kind of in a bad situation. Right. Or like Will's quote too. So I recognize that there's those trade-offs, and so I can understand when someone consistently makes good decisions and is able to move the ball forward even in bad situations.
Yep.
So there was this study. Have you guys ever heard of the notion of the 10x developer?
I had not.
Mm-hmm. All right. So this is a real hot topic. There's a lot of articles about the myth of the 10x developer, and also about the myth of the 10x developer. And there's some really good arguments on both sides, but I thought this is interesting because this is kind of a highly touted term for talking about what it means to be good and how you kind of can compare programmers. And it comes from a really flawed study that was actually done in, get this, 1968. 50 years ago. Programming was a little bit different back then. But the study was old. It was done on 12 different programmers. Not very many. They all had similar levels of experience, but only 12. And they did a couple tests over the course of like 2 afternoons. So not a great test, not a great sample size. And you got to kind of wonder, like, what kind of programming questions are you really getting answered in 2 hours here, maybe 4 answers there. Like, that's not the kind of things that I think about when I think about tough code. I talked about people making consistently good decisions and dealing with bad situations. And it kind of sounds to me like they kind of gave them a couple like toy or interview questions, timed them and said, oh my gosh, you're 10 times or 20 times better than the worst person. Now, I will say, though, that when I actually ended up writing an article about this, because I looked into why it was so controversial. Because to me, like reading that, I was like, oh man, this is obviously flawed. This is a terrible study. We shouldn't talk about it like this. But what I found is like there have actually been just like similar studies done on better sample sizes over the years with more modern languages. And they kind of substantiate the claim that like, you know what? it's not crazy for people to be an order of magnitude better than programmers at certain measurable things. And we could think about like basketball, like, is it totally crazy to say that the best player in the NBA today is 10 times better than the worst NBA player?
Yeah.
I tell you what, crazy. I definitely can't pronounce his name.
No, I mean, going back to your example of Kobe Bryant, right? I mean, let's pick him apart a little bit from a perspective of an NBA player, because I think what Joe just said was extremely important. A certain aspect of a programmer or a particular focus of a programmer could be. Kobe Bryant is definitely 10 times better scorer than the worst player in the NBA, right? There's no question. The dude dropped 81 points in a game. That doesn't happen, right? Dennis Rodman hardly ever scored 5 points in a game. So if you just took 10x by there, he's already beating him. I think
and that's what they did. They looked at individual tasks and said, this person is 10 times better scorer than this person. This person is 10 times better, rebounder than this other person.
Right. And that's where I think that there definitely are going to be people that excel at things, right? Like there are some people that are really good at algorithms, right? Like they have a math type background. And then there's some people that are really good at fitting the puzzle pieces together. This whole series that we just went over with clean architecture, right? That's another aspect of it that maybe not the math driven person is going to look at and care about, right? So I definitely think that there is room to say that somebody's 10 times better than another at a particular focus, right?
Yeah, this is definitely one of those flame wars. Like one quote actually from one of my homies named Brian Lyles said, is he likes to think of a 10x developer as somebody who can make 5 other developers twice as productive, right? Like somebody who can like amplify their ability amongst the team and make the team level up as opposed to being a rock star. I forget the dude's name from the Phoenix Project, but that guy.
I'm really interested in that topic of like that notion of a force magnifier, and I think like one of the things we talked about recently on the productivity and tech, like kind of the manager talk we had was like, as a manager, like you have the ability to magnify other people's outputs, like much greater than any one individual person. Like if you've got, say, a manager of 10 people, like theoretically, if they can remove the blockers, if they can facilitate that communication and make things go, like you can potentially have a lot more of a valuable outcome than you can as one individual contributor. At least that's what I think.
Man, I'm doing it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also the flip side of being like a quote unquote 10x developer, right? Like if you always like that amount of pressure all the time being on you, right? It could lead to burnout. It could lead to all kind of unhealthy things, right? Like a disproportionate amount of knowledge silo happening in the organization, like which is not scalable. So like if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, you win the lotto, like what's going to happen? How are they going to continue without you? Like it's just kind of all bad if you kind of get into superhero mode.
But there's also a flip side to it. I mean, Outlaw shared with me years ago, like I probably not too long after I met him, like they had done a code competition, I think when you were younger, and there was some dude that beat you, but you were pretty sure that your code was better and all this kind of stuff, but he got a little bit further along. And so then this whole question of a 10x, does the code quality matter? Or does it just mean output, right? Because if you can write an application 10 times faster than I can, but then nobody can maintain it after you, have you really created 10x what somebody else would do?
There's
right?
fast, and then there's maintainable is basically what you're going after.
Well, not just that. I mean, there's other aspects. I'm just saying that you can't measure, like it's hard to measure those things. There's not typically quantitative analysis of that type of stuff. You could probably say that you could take static code analysis after the fact and put grades on it, but there's still going to be how modular is your code, or does it scale well? Like there's going to be people who are really good at scaling. There's going to be people that are good at the algorithms. There's going to be people that are good at actually writing good patterns. Like, how do you measure some of that stuff, right?
Yeah, some people write ugly code, but it gets the job done and they write it really fast.
Right. And there's value in those type of people, by the way, right?
Yeah, going back to the minimal viable product, right?
Yep. I mean, yeah. Anyway, go ahead, Joe. Let's keep her chugging.
Oh yeah, I was just want to point out there's all sorts of stuff. Just like you were saying, Alan. Like there's meetings, there's Jira, there's communication, there's setting proper expectations, there's estimates. There's a lot of things that are estimates you can quantify pretty easily your accuracy there. But there's a lot of things that are just really tough to measure. But I don't think that's an excuse, especially after reading these books. I don't think that's an excuse for just saying like, well, we can't do it, because there are other people in other fields doing just that. Like whoever Kobe Bryant's coach is, He's not focused on maximizing Kobe Bryant's stats or any individual player's stats, right? They're focused on winning the Super Bowl or whatever.
Oh God. I knew you were going to do that.
Continuing the whole Kobe Bryant analogy, like one thing too that anybody, if you've like done any research into Kobe, like anybody who knows Kobe will tell you he's one of the hardest working people ever in the league. Like would show up and be shooting shots hours before the game, right? Like it kind of goes back to the whole notion that we're talking about deliberate practice. Like when Kobe was in the league, there was probably nobody outworking Kobe, and it showed every night, right? He practiced like he played, and you can't argue with the results.
And pretty much every famous player, continuing along with the NBA analogy, has been like that. I mean, Jordan was another one where, like, from the time that he, first got interested in basketball as a kid, he would spend every moment practicing that he could.
I mean, it's everything, right? It's everything in life. If you take the best person from the NFL, if you're sticking with sports, right? Jerry Rice, same thing. If you go with Tesla, this dude lives and breathes trying to change the way the world works, right? Like everybody that ends up becoming the best at what they do is somebody that's almost to a certain degree obsessed with what they do, right? Like, I mean, I know we all do it. We all look at our code and we're like, oh man, I could have made that better. Or I mean, that's the reason we do the podcast. It's the reason why, like Will, you read books all the time, right? You listen to podcasts. It's the reason we do practice stuff. It's because nothing's ever good enough to a certain degree, it's a good and a bad thing. But I think it transcends sports. It transcends everything. There are just people that always want to achieve the very best that they can possibly do. And that is how you get to a 10X, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of value. And even if you never make it to that 10X, like I wouldn't mind being 5, 6, 7 times more productive than I am right now, if that's theoretically possible. So maybe there's some things I could kind of get from looking at some of this research and some of these articles and books that I could kind of apply to software engineering to get me at least part of the way there. And even if I don't want to commit fully, maybe I could take some of this away and improve my life. And one thing I kind of noticed in looking at some of the books, particularly Peak, which we'll have links, and Outliers, is they separate knowledge from skill. So what they said was basically that knowledge is what you know. And when I say know, I mean like you understand, you grok. It's not enough to like be able to, recite the definition of like say solid, right? You need to understand it at a deep level. But there's still a difference between that understanding and being able to apply that knowledge. And I think basketball or sports is a great analogy too, because, you can have a coach or a mentor or a peer who really understands like the way the bones and the muscles and the nutrition and, they can grok all that stuff, but they're not going to be able to hit that percentage of field goals or, do whatever kind of skill level type thing that there is involved in. So they draw a line between those two. And what I kind of thought was funny when I was doing this research is like, I can tell you all day, I can list a long list of things, resources online for improving your knowledge. Things like Pluralsight, Code School, books. Just Google like your favorite language and getting started, and you're going to find 20 different articles going for that angle. So I feel like we're pretty well covered on the knowledge, but we don't really talk about how to advance skills so much in programming. You guys agree with that?
I do.
And I think some of the more kind of recent sites, like things like Code School, that kind of like try to intersperse some actual programming in between, or sometimes they actually have some like a mentor, like our buddy Jason Wyman over at Unity 3D College. He does like an intensive 6-week kind of almost like a boot camp, but he actually is there and is able to provide code reviews and whatnot in between those lessons and actually work with the people. And so I feel like our industry is kind of getting there by looking at some of the ways that other industries have handled this. And so I'm excited about that, and I want more of it. And we could see more, some more hot topics like, interview questions we kind of alluded to already, where like the job might ask you, how to balance a binary tree, and then you get into work and you're, changing the colors of divs.
But you're describing something different than just practicing on your own, though, right?
Yep. I kind of divide it into two parts. I say like there are things that you can absolutely do on your own. I call those the X for Ys. It's basically do a thing for X minutes at such and such skill level, and then measure your output. And so that works great for things like code wars or code fights or practice problems. If you want to get like a list of like, college, like discrete proving things by induction, like get a bunch of problems, do as many as you can at a certain skill level, time it, see how it goes, do the same thing, tomorrow, same thing after that, same thing after that. Those are really easy to do on your own because you can assess them without any sort of bias. But for those things that are not so easy to measure, like communication or, how effective you can be working in a team, things like that, I really think that you need some sort of either peer or mentor or some other person to work with. And I actually think there's some really good ways to get that, because even though it's hard and it's not nearly as easy as being able to kind of sit down, tap, do it on your own, thanks to the internet, it's never been easier to get this kind of help for any field.
Yeah. And the reason why I asked that, though, like, the mentoring kind of like coaching scenario part of it, right, is that it almost feels like there's maybe a little bit of backlash happening in the developer community, right? Where like for so long it has felt like, hey man, if you don't put in your 60 hours at work and you're not, you don't have your own apps in the app store that you're writing, and you're not contributing to all these open source projects, and you don't have a blog that you're writing, like, then you're doing it wrong, right? But, here lately it seems like, and maybe they were more than just lately, and I'm just only now recognizing them, but more questions and articles about like, hey, in my spare time, I don't write code. Does that make me a bad developer? Right? Like there's several articles like that, right? So it almost feels like there's backlash in that among developers about like, hey, I wanted to do something besides just sit behind a keyboard all day.
Yep, absolutely.
So how do you balance that?
I've got some ideas. I actually think that because it can be kind of hard to find like mentors or coaches, I think that the best way to do something like this is basically through some sort of work organization where like you do some sort of like pair programming, or you work with like a high output developer. If some sort of coach, or we'll say manager in this case, can kind of pair up good combinations of peoples, then there's actually a lot of really good tips for how to work in situations one-on-one to get a lot out of a little bit of time.
Will, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say one thing too. Like a lot of the people that I admire in, our developer ecosystem, do take breaks from being rock stars during the day, right? Like they hike or bike, you know what I mean? Like they don't just always, slam fingers to keys all the time. So like, I think it's important to have that balance. And some of the times, like the things that you see blow up, like Docker, right? Who knows how many years they spent writing that before it was a big thing. It wasn't like it didn't happen overnight. So I think sometimes like without that context, you don't really see the full picture of what went into what we see at the end of the day.
Yeah, and there's absolutely no obligation to kind of do this sort of stuff like day and night. I don't think you have to be Michael Jordan. If you want to be better, I think it's okay to put in some time and make yourself 5-10%, better. And I think that's really good if that's what you want to do. And you don't have to want to do it. And actually, one thing I kind of focused on is like I kind of looked at it as like, well, what advice do we have for advancing skills? And what I kept kind of seeing from people is like, hey, do a side project as a way of kind of learning to program. They would tell it to a lot of university students, like that's kind of the kind of standard advice. It's like, go do a side project. It's great on the resume, and it gets you some real world experience.
So you sound like that with your air quotes there, that you don't necessarily believe in that.
I believe that side projects are great for a lot of reasons, but I don't think after doing this reading, I don't think they're a great way of advancing skills. So if I want to be a better JavaScript programmer, then I don't think that a side project is the best way to do that.
What is?
I want to kind of catch it because I think that a lot of times your goal may not truly be to be a better JavaScript developer.
Better's good too.
You could be a butter. You could be a butter programmer.
You can also pick a peck of people peppers and all that.
That's pretty
Oh
good.
Man, you're good. You're good.
But
because
correct me if I'm wrong. I think we've all told people pick up a side project or go contribute to some GitHub project out there so that you can see how other people are collaborating and creating code and those patterns, right? So it sounds like you're saying that there might be a better way to build skill. So to be clear, when we're talking about doing a side project, it's to get practice in the entire thing, right? Like you don't say do a side project to just learn JavaScript, because that's not what you're going to be doing, right? You're going to be learning how to build an application. You're going to be learning how the files fit together on the file system. You're going to be learning how to commit it to source control. Like, it's more of the entire ecosystem, like the beginning A to Z type stuff, right? So what you're suggesting then is, if you're trying to build a particular skill, in this case JavaScript, then creating a side project may not be the right way to go, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm getting at. And I kind of think of side projects as being like akin to a scrimmage. You can think about like a soccer game, right? Like a soccer practice where we got all the soccer players together, 22 people on a field. You throw down one ball in the middle and say, go play soccer. That's a great way to build teamwork. That's a great way to get used to playing in games, and it's probably going to help you win. But it's not an
if they're
effective way.
like 7 years old, because then all the kids just rush to the ball, and wherever the ball goes, all
It's like
both
a pile
sides,
dance.
both teams, they're just all moving wherever the ball's going.
Right.
Even the goalies. Even the goalies.
So in a whatever, like a 2-hour soccer game, I think I ended up seeing that your average player would end up touching the ball 20 times, right? In the course of the entire 2-hour game. Now, practice, right? That's another story. For one, there's going to be a lot more balls, right? It's I think the ratio I saw for just the study I was looking at was 4 person per ball. So if you're interested in working on your ball handling skills, your passing ability, your ability to block goals is another good one, then a scrimmage is not it. Like, think about how many goals are attempted in a soccer scrimmage. It could potentially be very few. So your goalie, even though they're in a critical area of the game, they could actually be getting very little practice over that 2-hour game because, maybe the defense is doing a great job. I think about a kicker on a football game, right? They may only be in the entire game for 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes could win the game.
Okay, but let's think about this though. Because going with the sports analogy, I mean, you have a very targeted, very specific kind of thing that you're like, going with your kicker example, like, okay, I need to work on my field goal, long field goal attempts. So I'm going to keep moving the ball back and further and try to extend that distance, right? And my accuracy. But when you're talking about developing, like, what are you going to do? Like, I need to practice my array declarations. I need to make sure that when I make an array, it is spot on, awesome, right? Like, it's different.
Well, I think that is, and I'm curious where this is going to go, because I think that is really the bigger problem is if we're talking about sports, it's very easy to say a goalie's job is to block shots coming into this goal, right? Like, you have one very specific task that you need to get good at. And yeah, there's different approaches, right? Some balls are going to come up in the air, some are going to come down on the ground, some are going to be spinning, some are going to be moving, but you have one task. If you're trying to learn JavaScript now, are you trying to learn about memory management? Are you trying to learn about performance? Are you trying to learn about asynchronous? Like, I guess that's the thing is, where do you call exactly? Like, do you have to say the skill that I'm trying to learn right now is asynchronous JavaScript? And anything else I need to put completely to the side, right? Or like you said, I need to learn about the fastest way to access data in JavaScript. So I need to learn everything about the different data structures in JavaScript. Like, is that what you're saying? And then my next question is, how do you know that that's what you need to know? How do you know what you don't know that you need to know? And that's always, to me, the hardest part.
Yeah, and the one thing I was going to say too, like in keeping with the sports analogy, is one thing that you could have to be wary of. As a former athlete, you have these people who are like practice all-stars, right? Like you look like the man as long as nobody's guarding you, right? Mm-hmm. You can hit all the open threes. What are you going to do when somebody's in your face? Like, what are you going to do when the lights actually come on, right? And I think that one thing that we got to do, like as practitioners, is more so not trying to like practice to be a specialist, right? Like if I was the goalie, all you got to do is kick balls. All you got to do is block them all day. But really, we're more like Coach Belichick, right? Like I got to be a student. I got to like watch film, and also sometimes I got to get down and put my hand in the dirt and like show you how to do things. Like it's multiple facets to make you more well-rounded, not just practicing one thing at a time.
But hold up, let's take this to a different analogy then, because this is going to be the show where we talk about things that we never talk about apparently, because we're talking about sports ball a lot here, and that never happens, right?
Sports ball,
yeah. But let's take it to a military approach. When you go and you enlist in the Army, the Marines, the Air Force, whatever, you practice things over and over and over and over again, because when the time comes that needs to happen, it automatically kicks in. Like you don't think about it, right? And so, and this is where, so what you said about, the lights come on, things change. Practicing that skill over and over allows you to more easily go into auto mode as opposed to, don't get me wrong. There's some people who are just going to excel. Michael Jordan, right? We talked about him. That dude excelled at just destroying people at the end of a game. That's not something you can learn. You either have that or you don't in you. To a certain degree. I know you're making a face over there, but there are just some people that don't like, for instance, there are tons of people out there that all go to college. Some people excel at taking tests. Other people get crushed under the pressure. They know the information, but they get sat down, they have a timer, and they're like, they stress out, right? And so that's where I think it's important. I think what you're saying about the skills is very important. You have to test those. You have to use them. You have to practice them constantly so that those become second nature so that you can focus on the bigger picture when it's time to work on it, I think, anyways.
Well, that's a great way of putting it. I think of it as like a higher level abstraction to kind of bring it back into coding terms. Like when you're first learning how to do something, you think at a very explicit procedural level, right? When you think about like, say, playing guitar, right? You don't think like G, C, A minor, D. You think like middle finger goes here and index finger here. Keep it pointed up a little bit. Keep my wrist straight. It's very explicit and procedural, right? That's how you think, and you practice that thing 1,000 times, and it gets to the point where you think like, oh, play that song I like, right? And so your brain has created like a shortcut. It's created a label and is able to generate the output that you need. And so you're now dealing at a higher expressive level. Right? It's like working in a higher level of abstraction or a higher level language. You've moved that explicit procedural to now be implicit and declarative.
It's
you just say what you want,
right?
And it happens,
right?
And so that's what I'm kind of saying is like, if we can get this stuff down, like let's say like I want to be a better JavaScript programmer because I want to be able to think about my business problem, or I want to be able to knock out a bunch of code without refreshing and checking stuff in the console every 3 times because it's a distraction. Then I can focus on just that one thing to enable me to do other stuff. But you don't want to overtrain one specific thing. Like it's not going to help you to kind of be on the sidelines doing that like high kicking stuff that football players do. You don't want to do that for all of your practices, right? You want to have like some sort of balance. So you do want those scrimmages in there because they're important, but you also want to be kicking those field goals. You want to be doing, weightlifting and other kinds of like, muscle training as well. So that when the lights come on, you've already built this language so you can think at a higher level and accomplish things.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And the kind of the danger with side projects is that you can potentially have a lot of stuff going on. So I know like I have a bad habit of doing this with side projects. I just started one like 2 weekends ago where I got Elasticsearch, which I'm not too familiar with. I got Kibana in there for doing some visualizations. I'm doing it in .NET Core, right? So I'm not real familiar with that. I'm doing it all in Docker, which I'm also not familiar with. So I got like 5 different things. And what ends up happening is I start taking shortcuts because, I only got 2 hours before I got to go do something, right? So I want to get something on screen. So there's this incentive there for me to focus on the side project and the result. And what can happen there is other things start slipping, like unit test starts slipping, good abstractions, my clean architecture starts slipping because I just want to get Docker working. I want to get something on the screen before I have to be done for the night. But, and when it happens, I'm codifying.
But that's okay,
I'm reinforcing
though, right?
those bad ideas.
It's
okay depending on my goals.
Right. That's what I was going to say. Did you have an implicit or an explicit, I should say, did you have an explicit defined goal? Because maybe your goal is, hey, I want to see how all this stuff works together. And if that's what it is, then you've accomplished something, regardless of how poorly you did it, right?
Absolutely.
So I think it sounds like what you're getting at is what Outlaw just said is maybe that's not a bad thing. It just really depends on what you set out to do.
Yeah, I mean, how to unit test. So, okay, fine, if you skipped on that, but you were like picking up a new skill like using Kibana and Docker and things like that, like, and how to make those work to your advantage and their strengths, their weaknesses, that's a great skill, right?
Yes, but I'm also mixing knowledge in there at the same time. So what could end up happening is like, even though like I may be trying to focus mostly on say .NET Core, I'm getting tangled up. I'm not doing it properly. And even though I know, I could say that I've got the knowledge of the unit test. Like we know that's a skill. And we know that if you aren't unit testing up front, it gets real hard to add that in later, even if you have been a long time unit test practitioner, right?
Okay, but Okay, let's take a step back though, because that depends on what your goal is for this side project too, though. Like when you were talking about this at the beginning, I was thinking back to a lot of times where, I'll pick up the JavaScript framework du jour, and there's this one particular type of app that I just kind of like use as my guinea pig framework. It's kind of like think of the To-Do MVC app, right? Where you're just rewriting the same thing in every framework because you're not trying to focus on the functionality of the project. You're trying to focus on like, hey, how does this framework work? What are its advantages, right? And so if your goal is to learn those other things, then yeah, great. Who cares if you skipped out on the unit test, because that's not what you're trying to gain, right?
Yep. I just think we need to be careful with that, because sometimes you can let those other things slip. And when you let them slip, then you end up codifying or building them into muscle memory. So if you start like skimping on your bad variable names and bad abstractions, like those things can tend to slip when you're in, at the big game, when you're in the flow working, like those bad habits can kind of seep back in.
Well, one thing that we do in practice, like because I do TDD pretty much all day, every day, is what we call pretty much what you call a spike, right? It's like, hey, we're just going to throw some stuff together, exploratory, try to figure something out. But when we're done, we're going to scrap everything that we have and take back with us the knowledge of what we learned and then do things right, right?
Mm-hmm.
Write
like
tests
that
first,
approach.
do all the things, right? And that way you kind of get best of both worlds. You fast track to figuring out the thing, and then you go back and do it with good practices.
So that's interesting. So Will does pair programming, and what's really interesting about that is that I always wondered, right? Do you just start with a unit test, and no matter how crappy your code gets as you go, you're just going to live with it? But I like hearing that you guys do that. There is the ability to just go figure something out, take notes of what worked, and then throw it all away and do it clean. Like that's interesting. I know that was an aside to what you were talking about, Joe. I'm sort of more on outlaw side with this. Like I love the idea that you practice certain skills, right? Like we've talked about interviews before, right? Like if you're going to go interview with Amazon or Google or something like that, you better pick up, cracking the coding interview, and you better practice, and you better learn algorithms, and you better learn data structures, because I guarantee you're going to get hammered on it, right? So with that in mind, you start with a goal. You know that you need to know your data structures. You know that you need to know certain algorithms. You know that you need to think about things in a mathematical way when approached with a problem, right? So that makes sense to me. I think what it all boils down to is how well defined is your goal, right? If you're wanting to play with Elasticsearch, and by the way, you haven't had a chance to really look at Docker, but this is a perfect time to be able to get it sprinkled in. Like, I don't see that as a bad thing, It just really depends on what your focus is.
Well, I mean, we have talked about this though, and in past episodes, where I think even jokingly referring back to some of the projects that your side projects you've done, Alan, where you can sprinkle in too many unknown technologies, and then you fall into rabbit holes down one or more of those. So I do think it's wise and important to limit those, new kind of technologies until you feel like you really have a grasp on it before you start introducing other ones, because to avoid those kind of pitfalls, right?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, I know in my example here with the Docker, one thing I noticed is because I kind of did it from ground up with the focus on the side project, I've got a couple containers now that I'm able to talk to. I've got 3 containers, and they're all talking. They're all on the same network. It's awesome. But I know that there's this like Docker Compose thing that I should have used to kind of put this together. But I kind of, squeezed this stuff together based on a couple Stack Overflow answers. Right. So I'm not really doing things in a great way. And so if I were to say like, hey guys at work, here's my new project or whatever, like there's a good chance I'm going to kind of bring those, not so great learnings in and do it wrong. Whereas if I had started with a Docker course or a Docker book, then I probably would have done things in a lot easier way.
See, I disagree.
I think that's fine though. It sounds like you're setting like too high an expectation on it though. I feel like it's okay to iterate on the learning process.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll give a perfect example of something that you just said that I went through the same exact thing with Elasticsearch, because you'll look at it and you'll find, oh, there's this Docker image out there with Elastic. Cool, let me add it. Oh, well, I need it to be able to talk to this. Well, let me add that. Well, how do I make these things talk? Well, they're not on the same network per se. unless I force them all on the same IP. Well, this doesn't make sense. Well, how do people do it? Oh, there's this thing called Docker Compose. So it's like a natural progression, right? And then by the way, you're going to go figure out Docker Compose, and then you're going to find out, wait, this is not what the industry does. They use Kubernetes. And so then you're going to go from Docker Compose to Kubernetes, and then at some point they're going to be like, well, maybe Kubernetes isn't what we should do. We should do Docker Swarm. Not saying that's the path, but what I'm saying is I don't feel like the path that you took is wrong for what you tried to do, right? Like maybe you do introduce those things and maybe they aren't perfect, but guess what? It was a step in the right direction. I think we've all talked about the fact that programming and even learning should be an iterative approach, right? You're not going to get that knowledge and those skills without first taking some stumbles along the way. At least in my opinion.
But what if you stumble and you never get up? Like you stumble, you do things the wrong way, and you never get back to that.
Have you ever done that? Not get back to the side project. No, that's different. That's almost not fair.
But that's also why community is important too, right? Like whenever you're learning, you try to. Well, I guess if you're kind of like the stereotypical developer, you might be doing that in your own silo. But having like a network of people like the Slack channels, right, or Twitter, to bounce things off of, like, hey, I'm stuck, like infinitely stuck. Can you help me out? Like that's why that stuff's important when you like fall down to that degree.
Yeah, absolutely. Coworkers are another great case of that. So I think that's really important. Like that's like kind of like all those soft skills or anything that's you can't easily quantify. I think you got to bring other people in. Which I mean, I've got like an introvert. You know, I'm literally a card carrying introvert. This is like an introvert pin right here, a little turtle.
But it's such a what you're saying though is I don't know that I actually agree with the whole mixing incentives it can encourage bad habits. Okay, maybe it's true, but I feel like not doing that kind of keeps your boundaries too far in, right? Like I feel like you don't get to expand your boundaries if you're not willing to take some of those mistakes and those leaps just to find out, hey, what does this do? Or again, I think it really depends on what your goal was at the outset.
Totally.
If your goal was, I need to learn .NET Core, then you should trash everything else, not have a Docker container. You shouldn't be doing anything except working in, Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code and trying to hammer out some .NET Core stuff, right?
Yeah. So I think you're totally spot on. Like definitely side projects are good and just a matter of what you want. But I think you got to be really careful about making sure you understand what your true goals are and actually working towards those. It's like if you're doing a .NET Core project to learn .NET Core and you spend a half hour of your 2 hours messing with CSS, then either you cared about more CSS more than you thought, or you're not training effectively.
Okay, so I think that's the real takeaway here. As when we talk about being careful with your side projects, is to set realistic expectations of what you want to get out of that side project
and hold yourself to it.
Right.
Don't bite off more than you can chew. And be careful with codifying bad practices. Because have you ever cussed in front of your grandma?
Probably.
Yeah, like me once, right? Just once.
Does she knock the taste out of your mouth afterwards, or?
It's because I built up some bad habits, right? And something happened. I slipped, and my bad habit made it out somewhere I didn't think it was going to.
It's true.
Man, I'm just having a hard time. Like, I know where you're going with this bad habit thing, though, but I'm having a hard time applying that to code, though, because, man, like,
God, some of the best stuff you learn happens because you went outside your intended zone, right? Like you stumble across something.
That sounds like knowledge to me. You're talking about learning things like new concepts, new paradigms, new ways of doing things. Like that's kind of the knowledge side of the house. I'm talking about the things where like I need to get something done. I want to be able to type and solve my problem and be finished with it. I'm talking about the skill side of the house right now.
I mean, let's be real though, right? How many times have prototypes made it to production? Right, like something that's supposed to be throwaway.
Alan, you got some experience with this?
Every time.
And if you're not disciplined in those prototypes, you got sometimes garbage code out there supporting real life production.
But that's prototypes, though. I feel like that's different than a side project, though. If we're talking about a prototype, like when I think of side projects, that's like something in my spare time I want to learn, or maybe a skill you want to practice, like search, you want to write a binary tree or a linked list or something like that, just, to dust some of the cobwebs off of your head, right? And make sure you can do it, right? Like, am I going to take the time to like make sure I have proper unit tests and abstractions away just for something like that?
In
like,
a prototype? No.
Probably not. Now, if you're asking me to prototype a an application that might query a third-party system to retrieve data from it that, could be, might fit the form of an existing application. Maybe that one would be structured different. I could see that happening. Might be some relevant experience in-house there.
Might be. Yeah, I mean, so to your point, yes, sometimes prototypes made to production. Actually, I'd say 75% of the time it happens. But I will also, to a certain degree, argue for the business and say, does this thing do what it needs to do? If the thing is valuable enough and it warrants revisiting at some point in the future, there's nothing that says you can't iterate to make the thing better, right? So again, I mean, I know that we've just beat this thing into the ground at this point, and I think the part is we're all torn on it, right? Because I think that we all have gotten to where we are in our careers, which, by the way, all of us are very good developers, or we at least see each other as very good developers. We've all gotten here because we explore and we're curious, and it's almost like, why do we get called for support from our family on their computers, right? It's not because we're not computer support people, but we are those people that curious enough that when something happened to us, we learned everything about it, and then when somebody calls us, we're like, oh yeah, you just need to go do that, right? And so that's kind of where I'm going with that thing. So point
just
taken.
Be careful.
Yeah,
like bad habits are very real.
Yeah, they are.
You can see evidence of it. Like if you any sort of like little something that you do, it tends to get kind of built in because your brain is super lazy. It loves shortcuts. It loves stereotypes. Its biases, and a lot of those can be good for some things, right? It lets you take shortcuts on thinking. It lets you think at that higher level. But if you get some bad stereotypes or bad biases or bad habits kind of built in, then you can start making bad mistakes without even realize that you're making decisions because they're not conscious decisions. They're not deliberate. They're the things that just kind of fly out of your fingers when you're thinking about the business problem. And that's why I think we just need to be careful.
I think I'm with Joe, man. You kind of got to practice how you play, right? Or at least try to for the most part.
I'm somewhat there. I feel like Joe should have had his laser pointer so that he could have just flashed it in our eyes and been like, shut up, Pete.
I know from learning guitar, I know like a lot of times they would tell you like kind of learn something slow, learn it right, and then you speed it up. But the first time it was always like, learn it slow, learn it right. They don't say like, play it double time. And then eventually when you go to play it, half speed, it'll be fine. Like they emphasize getting it right first, because once you speed up, like those habits that you've built up doing it slow are what's going to come out, because your brain doesn't think like 1, 3, 4 next string. It thinks like A minor scale. Blah. The rest is generated. So there's a couple of really good books on Blink and Power of Habit in particular.
Cool.
And Power of Habit, like the whole book was really about how to break bad habits and how to replace them with good habits. And it kind of boiled down to one simple thing. They basically said there's like the cue, there's the action, and there's the reward. So if you want to replace that bad habit, you have to recognize the cue. So if you have a bad habit of like, say, writing crappy code, you got to recognize the cue might be you're under a deadline, or, you don't have all the requirements up ahead of time. And so you want to recognize whatever that trigger is that's kind of getting you to do this bad thing in this situation. And you want to try and replace that with the desired activity. And then, hey, treat yourself.
Cool.
There's a whole book about it, but there you go, 30 seconds.
Cool. I don't know why the like algorithm nerd in me was like thinking QUEU.
Right.
When he said Q.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, he means like pool cue.
Yep. So, hey, thank you for all the reviews this time. We got a ton of them. We really appreciate it. It really helps us out a lot, and we really thank you for it. And if you want to leave us a review, you can go to codingblocks.net/review and you find a bunch of links. You don't have to install iTunes. There's lots of other ways to do it, like Podchaser or Stitcher, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Hey, and while you're there, we've talked about earlier, there was a conversation about stickers that came up. And, if you check it out, like if you're watching the video here, you can see some new designs that we've made up. And if you go to www.codingblocks.net/swag, you can send us a self-addressed stamped envelope and we can send some stickers your way, including the lovely new layout.
You're going to Vanna White this thing.
Yeah,
I don't think I'm quite as pretty, but
Now, Alan, don't talk bad about yourself.
I know.
That's just wrong. All right. So let's head into my favorite portion of the show. Survey says. All right. So in a last episode survey, we asked, do you pay attention to third-party licenses? And your choices were, yes, because my company forces me to. Yes, because it's a good habit. No, wait, you actually read those things? And lastly, no, wait, am I supposed to? All right, so we're going to let our guest go first.
All right.
Price is Right rules.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
Let me take yes because my company forces me to with 57%.
No way, man.
57%.
You were crazy. You haven't listened to the show enough.
Now, Alan, don't be rude.
This is getting into a foot race, isn't it?
All right. I'll win that, just so you know.
Wait.
Here we go.
Now.
So what you got, Joe? What do you think this one is?
I think no wait, am I supposed to with 30%? And I'm wagering that most people are doing web development nowadays, and they don't really think about it too much because they're not distributing.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm trying to remember back. We had some sort of episode where we asked how big the company was that people work for. Mm-hmm. The smaller the company, the less they think about this stuff. I honestly believe. So I'm going to say no wait, you actually read those things, and I'm going to go with 35%.
35%. Alan says you actually read those things, 35%. Joe says I'm supposed to with 30%. And Will goes with because my company forces me to with 57%. Do I have those numbers right?
Those are correct.
That's correct.
Ding, ding, ding. We got a winner.
It's me.
Winner, chicken dinner. Alan takes it home.
Nice.
You actually read those things? 38% of the vote.
That's scary. And look, guys, that's really scary. we did an episode on this. I don't remember what it was. Episode 7
3.
or so. 3? Man.
No,
look.
I don't know. It's not 3. It's definitely not 3.
Yeah.
Don't listen to 3.
I mean.
Well, no, wait. You can listen to 3.
We won't rehash it here, but if you don't pay attention to them, you probably should. I mean, just look, if you work for a small company and you're writing code and you're just pulling in libraries willy-nilly, at some point, somebody else could own your code.
Yeah, you could be getting your company into some serious legal trouble if you're not paying attention to it.
Yeah, it's real.
And no license is not okay.
No, put a license in there. If there is a library that you're using or some sort of third-party utility that you're bringing in and they have multiple licenses, choose the one that you want to use with your product. And if you use anything like GNU, and take a hard look because a lot of times that means you have to open source your code. So yeah, there's a lot of nuances there, and that scares me a little bit. What was the second answer? Probably Joe's. No, am I supposed to?
Yeah, no, everyone missed it. Yes, because it's a good habit.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah.
All right.
28% of the vote.
That's surprising.
Yep.
That really is surprising.
So like more than 50% were split. Like, those were the largest percentages of the vote, right? And they're split.
Literally in half between yes and
because
no.
it's a good habit. Not because I have to, but just because it's a good habit. And no, and it's a bad habit because I'm supposed to.
Wow.
So it's a good thing that we're talking about habits here.
Right? Get in the habit of looking at the lights. As a matter of fact, like I know you do, I do, Joe, you probably do. I'm assuming Will, you probably do too. Like if I'm looking up something that I'm going to use, the very first thing I do is search the page for license. And if it doesn't come up, then I go to the code and say, where is the license file? And if it's not there, I'm like, yeah, I don't really think I can use it. Or I'll contact the author and be like, yo, dude, can you add a license? Because we can't use this.
Better yet, pull request, dude.
Yeah, right? No, that's a good point.
That's a good idea. Why
I
not,
never even
right?
thought about that. Apache license. Here we go. Boom.
That's my tip for the week.
Right in the show as we go.
All right. So for this episode survey, we ask, do you participate in open source projects? And your choices are yes, but only my own projects. Or yes, but only when I'm trying to beef up the resume. Or yes, but it's documentation, not code. Yes, but I only participate in projects owned by others. Or yes, I have some of my own projects and I also participate in projects owned by others. And lastly, man, I'd love to, but dang, who has the time? All right, so continuing on with our conversation here, let's get into deliberate practice. And what does that mean?
So I kind of dogged on side projects a little bit, even though I do still think they're really good, but just not the most effective way to practice skills. So the question is, what is the most effective way? And what the kind of the general consensus is right now is that deliberate practice is the best way to advance skills. And what they mean by that is basically just a results-driven feedback loop that requires focused attention. And so, like the example I gave in my talk was that playing your favorite song on guitar is not deliberate practice. But if you record yourself and you grade yourself on the various skills involved, like say chord changes or your legato, your staccato, and then you slice it up, you measure it, see how well you did, and then devise specific practices around those particular areas. That's deliberate practice.
So
another example is like Karate Kid. Wax on, wax off. Mm-hmm. He was practicing specific movements that were later incorporated into like the real thing.
But they weren't quantifying it. What you're saying is the key element, right? Is actually measuring your results after doing the practice.
Okay. I mean, can you still get the value out of it without the measurement, though?
That's a good question. I think the idea behind measuring it is just to kind of make sure that you're doing it right. So if you can kind of get the sense that you're doing it well enough and that you're maintaining like kind of the correct form, then I think it's okay. I think same with kind of like weightlifting is a good example where like it's really easy to have bad form when you're say doing a squat or a deadlift. But I think that once you kind of get that form down right, I think it's, you could probably get away with not having a spotter there or doing that stuff on your own. And so I do think that there's value to doing that. And, realistically, this stuff's hard to do, with other people. So I think that's kind of our only option.
But what does measurement mean in this sense, though? Are we talking about like, understanding the space-time complexity of the problem that you just solved and trying to better that? Or are we talking about like, well, I solved this problem and I wrote these 10 unit tests and it passes those and that's good enough? Like, what does it mean?
Yeah, a couple different things. So if you're doing an X for Y, I could say like, I'm going to do level 4 JavaScript programs focusing on fundamentals, and I'm going to do it for 20 minutes. I'm going to set a Pomodoro timer. I'm going to count how many I did correctly. The first time 7, second time 6, third time 9. I should be seeing that stuff go up and to the right. So the measurement there is my number of problems. Now, if it's something like a soft skill, it gets a little bit tougher. But what I could do is like do some sort of like little pet project, send it over to my buddy Will and say, hey, Will, I'm not going to ask you how my project is because that's a crappy question. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say, how's my architecture? Or how are my variable names? Or am I getting my intent across? How are my dependencies managed? How does this look? I want to ask those kind of specific questions, and I want them to grade me on those specific asks. And so that's another way of measuring things that are kind of harder to quantify. An example I like here is there are actually like a ton of like writer groups out there on the internet, like for people who want to get better at writing. And one interesting thing they'll do is a lot of times have like kind of tasks or quests for a week. So like one week might be, hey, write 100-word action thriller story that doesn't use any weak words or doesn't use pronouns or doesn't do something else, or they'll have some sort of theme. They'll have some sort of goal there with that writing. A bunch of people will submit it. They'll mix it all up, and basically everyone kind of does some cross feedback where they focus on the one thing. And of course, if you got some other feedback in there, you can slide that in. But the goal is really just to kind of focus the exercise and the measurement on that one thing. So it's not great to say, how's my project? You really want to focus on that one thing.
I like that.
Yeah, and they got a couple rules for the deliberate practice. They say it's intentional, which is saying that you know what your goal is. It's not just to write good code. It's going to be more focused than that. You want it to be improving appropriate, so something that you can actually get better at. Responsive. Now, this is what I really like. What they mean by responsive is that you get fast feedback on it. So the example that I like here is something like ReSharper or a good IDE, where as soon as you type that like unconventional variable name, you go to the next line. Boom, squiggle marks right there immediately telling you as soon as you make the mistake that you should go back and fix it, because it's so much more valuable to do the right thing and encode that success than it is to find out a week later when, someone emails you back and lets you know, hey, that's not the standard for Java. Finally, it's repetitive, so it should be an exercise that you could do more than once and see how you do. And then the fifth rule I really like, it should be not fun.
That's a hard one for me to wrap my head around.
The not fun?
Yeah.
I can see that with you because what I know about you is that you've got kind of a mind for practicing. I think that you get a lot of fun out of seeing things go up and to the right.
Yeah, because I feel like that's the thing that keeps you motivated, keeps you wanting to practice. Like if I'm not having fun, I'm more than likely not going to do it. You know what I mean?
And I think the contrast, what I kind of got out of them saying it shouldn't be fun is that you shouldn't be slipping into flow. If you guys are familiar with the notion of flow, it's basically that feeling where you start typing on the keyboard, you take a sip of coffee at 9 a.m, and you put the coffee cup down and what the heck, it's dark outside because I've been coding for 8 hours straight. I closed, more tickets than I thought I was going to be able to. And I feel great and energized and refreshed afterwards. And it's basically that kind of state of mind where your brain is occupied. So it's solving challenging problems. So you're not getting bored, but it's not too hard that you're having to really struggle with it. So things just kind of float right out of you and you actually feel good at the end of it.
Well, I think I get the intent here, though, is a lot of times you skip doing things that just aren't inherently fun to you, right? Like you're not going to go out of your way to learn something that doesn't interest you to a certain degree, right? And so you might be missing out on some of those skills that you might not pick up. Have you done a binary sort recently? Does that sound like fun to a lot of people? Probably not, right? Like if you're interviewing for a job, it's a necessity, right? To him, it says, yeah, totally. But I mean, it's one of those things that I think the purpose of this is it's easy to go after things that are in your wheelhouse. It's easy to go after things that you would typically go after anyways. But if you're truly trying to better yourself all around, then you also need to look at those things that, like big O notation, right? Like, why does it matter to people, right? It's not something that's really all that, for me, it's not fun to look at. Like I've watched the Stanford YouTube videos. I did the stuff in college, and it's one of those things that you really have to get back into completely to really drive those points home. And it's just not fun. It's almost like a drudge, right? Like I think 3 of us or maybe 4 of us signed up for the course at one point, and we all dropped out after 3 weeks because it was like, man, this is a lot of work, Yeah. So, yeah.
You're talking about, I think it was a Coursera algorithms program out of Stanford.
Yeah, and it was heavy duty. Like, it was one of those things where you're like, yeah, this, I thought I was going to get to just play around and learn some stuff, but no, they want me to do homework. And this is I don't want to do homework. Like, what's that?
I think that the kind of the problem with getting in that sort of flow and kind of having too good of a time with it is that it generally, what they're saying is that if you're having a really good time actually doing the thing and you're not having a good time because of the outcome, then you're probably kind of in that flow where things aren't too challenging. And so you're kind of able to rely on kind of your instincts and that muscle memory that you built up. And it feels good to kind of solve those problems and get those wins because it's, you're hitting all the targets, right? And it feels good. But you're not pushing on your limits. You're not kind of pushing on the boundaries of your abilities. So you're not moving forward and you're kind of stagnating. So it could be great for getting through the work week. It would be wonderful to be in flow Monday through Friday all the time. But what they said is basically it's not an effective way to advance your skills.
So might it be a better way to phrase it then, instead of saying that it should not be fun, that it should be hard? Maybe.
I think, but we don't want to go too far too, because one thing that they kept pushing back on is you don't want to just dive into the deep into something, and that's because it's really easy when you're way out of your depth to do things in a wrong way. And so, an example I like here is wakeboarding. If you've ever done wakeboarding and you've never done it before, or maybe even learning to dive, something like that. You don't want to go off the high dive, the highest, because you don't really know what you're doing. You haven't built up the skills. It's probably going to hurt when you smack that water. And so if you can kind of build up to something in a way that is better aligned with your current skill level, then it's going to go faster and be smoother, and you're less likely to codify bad habits.
That makes sense.
Yeah, one feature I wish there was a number 6 where they include the stickiness factor, and you want to keep coming back to it, right?
Yeah.
That would be a cool thing to measure. Say, for example, when you're lifting weights, right? The stronger you get, the more your body starts to change. It keeps you wanting to come back to the gym and keep improving.
Yeah, I like that. And one thing too to contrast to the scrimmage or the side project thing too is it can be a lot easier to pick up on a practice than it can be on a side project. If you go 3 weeks without touching that side project, or 6 weeks, or you don't have a lot of time to it, it can be hard to get back into it depending on how you left off. But if you are doing JavaScript level 4 problems for 20 minutes, the barrier to entry there is having 20 minutes.
I almost equate it to video games. Like it's kind of an odd analogy, but video games that I play nowadays, which I don't get to play that much, it's usually things that I can pick up and do fast and then put down. Right? Like people that go and play Elder Scrolls or Oblivion that are like 600 plus hour games, that those hold no interest to me because I know I'm never going to get there. And even when I play it, I have fun, right? Like somebody will buy me the game and I'll play it for 2 hours and I'm like, wow, that was a lot of fun. I'll never play it again. Right? Like it's seriously like that. Whereas if it's a basketball game or if it's Call of Duty, I know I can jump on, play for 30 minutes, have fun, and then I'm done. Right? And so it's kind of similar to what you're talking about with the skill is you get in there, you had something tangible that you walked away with, right? Like you feel like you accomplished something. Whereas sometimes side projects, honestly, can just be sort of frustrating, right? Like you look at it and you're like, man, I suck because I tried to do this and, I got so far. .NET Core was a perfect example. I got into it and I was like, well, if I'm going to make a real world app, then I need people to be able to log in. They need to create accounts. Well, I'm not just going to create an account. I need to figure out the identity service. So
it's got to be secure. I got to secure these identities.
And wait, now there's J tokens and you can do things. Wait a second. So now I got to go into OAuth. Like literally before I even get anything done, I've got 30 other things.
We don't even know what we're authenticating to yet,
but you got to have Facebook, Google, GitHub.
Yeah.
So yeah, yes, I like this. I like the fact that if you do focus on the skill, you have something that you actually feel like you accomplished, right? Like it's a task that you can walk away and say, done, and if I want to come back and polish up on it later, I can, and it's not that huge barrier to entry.
In the future, Alan, just use Okta. You get all that stuff for free.
Which one?
Okta.
Okta? Mm-hmm. I don't think I've heard of that.
This is why those peers are so important.
So how can I practice this stuff though?
Yeah, and we mentioned a couple of these, like the X for Y categories. There's one I really like, the regex crossword. I think I gave it as an example or my tip of the week a while back, where it actually kind of lines up different regex on different axes, and you got to find the commonality between those two regexes in like a crossword type format. That's a kind of extreme example. Same with Code Golf. But Code Wars, I think, is like the ultimate kind of X for Y here, because I can say JavaScript level 4, 20 minutes, count how many I do at the end. And once that bottleneck gets to be my typing speed, then I can go ahead and up the level on that. And I think that, I am still kind of mixing ththings there, because like on one hand, like I'm talking about solving the problems. On the other hand, I'm talking about learning JavaScript. And so you do still have to be careful about that. But I do think you need to learn, your language really well before you can really get to that level with the algorithms. Because if you're taking that 2 seconds to look up like the syntax for slice or splice or map or filter, or is this capitalized or not, if you don't have that kind of implicit declarative language built up in that higher level thinking, then you're constantly going to be tripping on stuff, and you're not going to be able to kind of unlock your potential to really fly on that stuff. So I think you've got to have the basics down. And I think those X for Y things like Code Wars are a great way to do that.
One thing that's neat though, looking at the list you have here, like Code Wars and HackerRank, the usual suspects, is like these sites are sort of focused on like writing code, right? But are there any sites that you can go to, or like any resources for like learning how to become a better code reader? Right, we spend like an inordinate amount of time like reading code, right? But how often do we practice like becoming better at catching up and picking up context?
Oh, that's
on code you didn't write.
That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, I really like that. You imagine if I wanted to get better at understanding code, like one side project or one type of exercise I might do is like I find some sort of code online that's not too long, and I read it, and then I try to explain in like one sentence or some sort of like tight, concise thing, like exactly what's going on.
Well,
I think that just by trying to do that really help.
The regex crossword puzzle that you mentioned, though, that is an example, because you have to be able to read the regex and understand it. Now, how you would apply a similar kind of concept to something outside of just regular expressions, someone more creative than me will have to come up with that.
Hey, that's a tough problem, but it's an interesting one, though, because that's actually where resourcefulness and people's thought process comes into play. I will say, like Code Wars, like when I did it initially, it was fun, but it also frustrated me because after I got into it, like my mind is trained to, you know, validate the inputs, validate the outputs, you know, do these things, try and do things nice and neat. And it turned out it was all about who can write the most creative way to do this entire thing in one line. Right. And it almost got to the point where it was like, man, I don't really feel like I'm getting that much. I don't feel like I'm getting that much useful takeaway from this, right? Like, don't get me wrong. It was cool to look at some of the answers and be like, oh, I'd have never thought about doing it that way, but I would have killed anybody that would have put that in my real code because you can't understand it, right? The fact is, if you saw that in source code somewhere, you'd be like, okay, let me go do a git blame and find out who wrote this so that I can go yell at them, right? Because it doesn't make sense. And so I think you have to be careful. I love these resources because it's a good way to get practice and it's a good way to learn how to solve problems, right? Because they'll throw a problem up there. But, you know, just be aware that sometimes, you know, just the way that they get to the outcome isn't as important as just understanding the thought process of how you should get there, you know?
Yeah, and one thing I like about Code Wars is you can actually tag solutions and vote them up. So like when you solve problems, I don't know how new this is, but if you solve a problem and go look at the solutions, people will tag them as best practices or novel solution or shortest solution and kind of vote them up. And I really like to see other people's solutions. And sometimes, particularly Dance to Die and Robert have really creative solutions that are always different from how I think about it. And so I get a lot out of that. But I totally agree that if you're just focused on like, say the lines of code or getting that problem done in that 20-minute span, then you're probably taking some shortcuts to get there that are codifying those bad habits. And so you just got to be careful about, you know, slicing up and making sure that you're addressing the things you actually want to get better on.
Cool.
And, you know, we talked a little bit about soft skills. Like, I think communication is really important. We didn't talk about it too much, but if I can express my ideas to my coworkers and, you know, my managers, if I can express an idea to them eloquently and concisely, I can say one sentence and they just get it and they understand, and we don't have to have a 2-hour meeting. Or if I can drop just the right comment at just the right time or write just the right email, there's immense business value to that, to getting everyone on the same page very easily. And so communication is a skill I'm particularly interested in. And of course, you know, the podcast is another reason why I'm interested in this, and it's another avenue of me trying to kind of get better at it. But I do think that stuff is part of being a better programmer, at least to me.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard, but our communication skills at describing triangles and graphs, we are amazing at it.
They're off the chart.
Yeah.
Fun.
Like, I see what you did there. I like that.
That's good.
Another outlet that you don't have listed is like participating in hackathons, like showing up and offering your development skills for somebody trying to build a product with like a team of complete strangers is also another way to kind of work those soft skills muscles and also get some like gratification out of it as well from a technical perspective.
I like that. I honestly think that for developers, a lot of times soft skills are overlooked a lot. Like it's the thing that they put the least amount of effort into. And honestly, if there's one thing that'll hold most people back in their careers, it's probably this right here. You can be the most amazing programmer on the planet, but if you can't communicate, or if you're hard to deal with, or you're brash, or you act like you're better than everybody else, at some point that is going to limit you. At some point that's going to hold you back. And granted, there's going to be exceptions to the rule, but being able to communicate and being able to work with others is huge, just immense in what it can do for your career.
Cool. And another trait that I can think of that would probably fall sort of under do X for Y as well as soft skills is exorcism. So exorcism is cool because it has these exercises, but you can also have people who have like expertise in that particular language or framework give you feedback and say, hey, this is sort of not idiomatic. You kind of want to try to do things this way and that way. And you can kind of iterate and learn that way from it's like crowdsourced code reviews in like a gamified way. It's pretty cool.
Yeah,
is it exorcism? Exorcism.io?
Yep, exorcism.io.
Oh, so like exercise, not exorcise.
Like exercise, yeah.
I thought it was like, you know, getting the evil out. All right, got it.
Our buddy Dance to Die actually did a thing on interviewing.io, which is a site where you can actually practice interviewing with a person, and they'll give you sample problems and you kind of like work through it with them, and they push you, they do some questions, and then they give you the video at the end with their feedback and say, hey, this part didn't work on this, you know, that sort of thing. So I think that's a really cool kind of service too. And, like kind of talking about the scrimmage example, like you could definitely argue that the best way to practice interviewing is to go interview. But if you like, say you live in Seattle or somewhere, you don't want to necessarily burn those learning experiences. You don't want to burn those companies that you actually want to work for practicing, right? So you don't want to go out to the Microsofts or the Amazons or whoever else is around your area, the best companies, and practice on them, right? Those are the goals, depending on what you want. And so I like the idea of being able to practice those sort of things in isolation and work with a service. So you're not actually taking, 6 hours off work to go practice an interview.
This is pretty cool. How do you sign up to be an interviewer? Do you know?
Say what?
Oh, how do you sign up to be an interviewer?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
I know there's a website someone told me about called Carrot. I think that where you can actually sign up to be an interview for other companies, or like you're actually like a kind of admin, okay. Almost like a test giver, and then they actually pay you per kind of interview that you run. You turn the videos over. I
think I found it on their FAQ. You just send an email to like this address, and they'll get in touch with you.
What do I need? Yeah, that's interesting.
Sending email now.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Cool.
So another couple ideas I have were basically just around static analysis. And that really, I was just thinking more like this, the resharper will kind of give you the squiggly lines and say like, hey, this could have been a link statement, or hey, if you move this if above here, you can shorten your cyclomatic dependency, whatever, cyclomatic complexity. And you can look at those kind of numbers and just see what you get. So it's a little loose. I mean, ideally, you'd be working with somebody. I mean, that ultimately, everything comes back down to you're better off working with somebody.
Yeah, but I mean, using those static analysis tools does give you an opportunity where, if you can't, or maybe it's like really late in the evening and you just don't want to like wake anybody, then at least you could see like, hey, am I in the zone of pain? Right.
Mm-hmm. And it gives you scores, right? Like it's quantitative, which is nice.
Yeah, and I know for me, I mentioned communication being kind of one of my goals for this year. Another one is just really architecture and kind of writing good maintainable systems that are going to be easy to change. And getting practice on that can be really hard, especially if architectural decisions are often made up front in a project. And you end up kind of dealing with the after effects, forever after. And so how do you get practice with something like that that's really important, but doesn't actually come up that often? It's kind of like the kicker example at football.
I feel like architecture, more so than anything, it definitely benefits from like a mentorship and being around other people who've built systems and experienced things. Because like it's hard to learn that stuff through osmosis. You kind of got to work with somebody who's sort of been in the trenches, right? You can like read all the Martin Fowler that you want, right? It doesn't resonate as much as working side by side with somebody who's done it before.
So true.
There's a book I really like called Practice Perfect. We've got a link down there in the resources section, and it's actually 42 tips where they took basically their lessons learned kind of teaching and mentoring and coaching, and they actually spent a lot of time looking at actual teachers in classrooms and kind of figuring out how those teachers best express the ideas to the students and how they actually like maintain discipline and whatnot as well. And so that book's got like a ton of just really great, like hard and fast kind of ideas, or I don't want to say rules because they're not hard and fast rules, but just kind of ideas for things. And one thing they really hammer on over and over again is practicing just about everything. Like if you're a manager, man, if you can find someone to work with you, and if you've got like a tough conversation, you're kind of not wanting to like say like you've got to give someone a bad review or something, you've never done that before. Like, man, if you could just do like a 10-minute kind of walkthrough with a friend of yours or something, just kind of practice, just do it out there once. That second time is going to go so much easier. At least that's my own experience with that sort of thing. If you can just get one or two little kind of trial runs, like flush out some of the stumbling points, then life can be so much easier for you.
Yeah, I know people that speak at large conferences. I remember, I know, Joe, you and I listened to Smart Passive Income, and, Pat Flynn from that, like he would stand in front of a mirror and do it, many, many times before he went out on stage so that he had it down, right? Like, and he did it like he was going to do it live. So it definitely helps.
Yep. And I've got a couple quick rules of just kind of jumping for a little bit of practice. They say the first and most important thing is to identify your goal. And, as it has come up quite a bit tonight, it's really important to hone in and really grok and understand what it is you really want. Because it's easy to kind of either not understand what it is you want or to not actually practice towards the thing that you truly desire. So understand your goals, and then mapping the relevant skills just means like, say, the interviewing example, you might kind of do a little mind map and say, well, there's whiteboarding, there's answering tough personal questions like what's your biggest weakness or whatever. There's algorithmic analysis. There's kind of all sorts of different things. So you could probably come up with a list of like 20 things that are involved in interviewing. And then after you've mapped those skills, not knowledge, just skills. So even like speaking comfortably is a skill. Then you're going to want to assess those individually. Sometimes you can kind of lean on past experience a little bit. And so I know that there's things in interviews that I have more trouble with than others, like rambling. And then one thing I like is saying identify a high value target. And high value, I like that way of saying it because sometimes you want to play to your strengths. If you've got a great field goal, like sometimes you want to take that 80% shot rate to 85. But sometimes you also want to do the opposite. You want to focus on something you're really terrible about because you're going to get bigger gains in that area for your time spent, theoretically. Or else maybe, there's some other reason. So there's a skill that's not necessarily you're that good at or that bad at, but it's high value because maybe it's got some sort of other crossover in your life. So for me, like getting organized would be a good skill to work on because it would make my wife happier in addition to my boss. Wait, what are you thinking about?
Well, I'm trying to like figure out how to the high value target as it relates to code and practicing there. So I guess is that something like you mentioned map and slice earlier, like, okay, I want to see how those work or yeah. I was just trying to figure out.
That's like the nuts and the bolts of the language. But then like another thing could be like, what about writing or interacting with other people's code? I think that there's a lot of people in there that like as soon as it gets to other people's code, like all the rules go out the window because they don't really want to change stuff too much or they don't feel comfortable. Maybe they don't want to read as much code as they probably should because they just want to focus on the one little additive if statement that they can add to make the problem go away. And maybe that's something you want to work on, or maybe you have a bigger issue with greenfield problems where you start to prototype things and those end up in production. And the whole time you kind of like took little shortcuts to get stuff showing on screen. And so maybe you actually tend to work better with, bugs than you do with greenfield type stuff.
Yeah. Or it might be something like fluency. Like, hey, I want to make sure I'm more fluent whenever I get ready to write a link statement, right? Instead of fumbling through and having to Google and figure out all the right keywords to use.
Yeah, and link's a great example. Like if you really know your link stuff, you can use that sort of stuff all over the place. And before you really know link, there's all sorts of crazy like aggregate stuff that you're going to be doing with for loops. And it just that's more cognitive weight. That's more stuff you have to think about. If you can just kind of dash out like a 2-liner to do it and move on, then you're spending more time focusing on the business problems.
Y'all proud of me? I knew like a C# thing.
Yeah, I mean,
there's Java lambdas. There are
and streams.
They confuse the heck out of me. I've been trying to work with them lately.
Yeah, and then finally, you want to design your exercise. It's going to target one thing. We talked about that. And you want to do the exercise, and we got a cute little go-to step number 2 here because we got a little cycle going on. Of course, so you want to keep repeating this stuff.
So should this list be bad form? Then should we like peer review this pull request and say that like this is bad form because you used a go-to statement?
Yeah, I don't like that go-to statement.
Yeah, what's up with that?
I started the list with 0 though to get some cred there.
Definitely.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, I was going to give you props for that because even in the article, going back to when we were talking about the 4 reasons why the 10x developer is controversial, I noticed that those were also 0 based. So your array counting skills are pretty good. We got to work on that go-to skill though.
Right?
At least give number 2 like a better label
perfect.
than just 2. That's a magic number.
Go-to 2.
Wow, you didn't realize that we were going to review this, did you?
Yeah.
Oh man, yeah. I'm
On-air code review.
blushing.
That's right.
So I mentioned that book, Practice Perfect. That's definitely a really good one if you're into mentoring and coaching and you're interested in some like real tangible kind of thoughts on that side of things. And I do think work is the best place to do it because you've already got a bunch of people and you've got a vested interest in everybody doing things and being consistently. So if you could take some time away, even if you don't peer program often and do a couple little exercises or get people together and like focus on one or two things like tracking down a bug. I think there's a lot of value of like, say, me and Alan trying to track down a bug that I would only track down on my own because it's in my area. All of a sudden he's here. Now he's got different tools or different viewpoint on things. And at the same time, he's also getting kind of like a nice little tour of my stuff and the way I think about it and the way I kind of debug it. And so
it is funny. I just for those out there, when I go to debug a problem, I don't want to hear anything about, I just want to know what the problem is. I don't want anybody to tell me anything about how they've tried to find the problem because I don't want it to cloud my judgment. I want to stumble through and figure out, because it might have been just one thing that somebody just assumed in one spot that I'm not going to assume or whatever, right? Like I like to solve the problem from beginning to end. And it's almost like when somebody wants to design a system or something, like I want to know what the problem is. What are you trying to solve? Don't tell me what you want done. Mm-hmm. Tell me what your end result is, what you're trying to look for. And that's, I love approaching problems that way. And I like for other people to think about them that way too, because somebody will think about something that I didn't think about, right?
Does that also include like people being like, hey, here's what I tried already before you?
Yeah, I don't want to hear it.
Okay.
Not up front, right? Like I want to at least take a minute to get my head into it, right? Like tell me what the problem is, but don't step me through it because then it's going to take my mind off my natural, curious, whatever it's going to do, right? I do want to revisit at some point. Like maybe I don't go through it completely, but I at least want to get my head wrapped around it first before anybody starts, injecting things into my mind.
So don't stand over your shoulder and say, tried that.
Oh,
tried that.
No, don't do that to me. Oh my God.
I'm bumping your head with my belly.
All right. Now things just got weird.
I've been there.
Moving right along.
Oh, geez. Yeah. Sorry. I'm like reliving a manager nightmare right now. So eating an apple over my head, popping me in the back of the head with the belly.
Oh, man.
Hey, Peter. What's happening?
Oh, man. Yeah. So I think we actually covered most of these tips for practicing. We talked about flow being a little dangerous because skills can stagnate. And one study they actually looked at there was with doctors who have diagnoses to do, and then they validate the diagnoses and, looking at like tumors and stuff like radiology type things. And what they found is actually, like a lot of the people who would look at these things would kind of peak after a certain amount of time, where it's like year 5, they're at like peak diagnosis. And then after that, it kind of trails off. And I think a big part of that is because your brain just loves those shortcuts. And so you can find a shortcut that works 80% of the time and is a lot easier than that 85% of the time, then a lot of times it's going to kind of want to fall back into there if you don't have somebody kind of reining you in.
So wait a minute. Is the takeaway here that you don't want a doctor who's been practicing for more than 5 years? Like,
I think that's what
once your doctor has practiced for more than 5 years, you got to go find another doctor.
Machine learning, I think, pretty sure I heard on the podcast, is going to be replacing all the doctors in all the world within like the next, 6 months or so.
It is funny though when you think about it, just from a pure human perspective. People that are newer at something take more care in getting it done, right? The builder who's building his 1,000th house is going to take so many shortcuts, like walls aren't going to be completely square, that kind of stuff, right? Like as opposed to somebody that's just getting started, they're really going to want to do a good job, right? Like it really does make sense to a certain degree. So I'm changing all my doctors.
Well, as a programmer, like I know that no program I write is going to be perfect. So I'm probably like quicker to jump to that, like, good enough than like somebody who's only been programming for like 2 years.
It is interesting. I mean, it really does. I mean, like if you were going to go take on a task that you'd never done before, you're probably going to watch 20 YouTube videos. You're going to know every single downfall that could happen, and you're going to plan around all of them. It's going to take you 12 hours to do this 30-minute task, but by God, it's going to be amazing, right? And it's interesting when you think about that.
I can put this into a real coding kind of thing.
All right.
When we were all learning to code, right? Your first, like, let's just take it down to like a C-like language, okay? And you're learning loops and for loops, for example, right? And you're really getting that down, and you're using you use them for everything, everywhere. Anytime that you need a loop, you're like, for loop, that's my boy. And then you make your way into like a C#, and you're like, oh man, this for each is amazing. You mean I don't have to worry about the iterator? And then you get lazy and you start using the for each in places where, you know what, that for statement would actually be more performant if you used it, but you've gotten kind of lazy and you're like, oh, you know what's going to be good enough? This for each is just going to be good enough.
And by the way, that enumerator might actually blow up if you change something because now you change the collection underneath it. Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, yeah, you're definitely right. You get sloppy, and I think it happens to everybody over time, and it's just natural.
But, you know, I was thinking about some of this stuff as Joe was talking about, like, because there was the one point that he made about, like, you know, hey, don't just ask how the code is, ask about specific things, though. And it made me feel a little bit better about, you know, there are times where, not necessarily from a practice point of view, but just like, you know, I'll look at it from the point of view of like a pull request. Like, you know, I'll ask someone specific to either an area of the app or a particular skill set and be like, hey, man, tell me, like, do you think I'm crazy for doing this? And I'll explain, like, you know, here's the thing. Look, you take a look at it and tell me, is this crazy? Do you want to immediately revoke or, you know, decline this pull request because of this, right? So I feel like, you know, that kind of, I don't know, I guess I should think of it as mentoring in that case, but that kind of peer review that what Joe's talking about, though, is kind of along that line, maybe. And that's a way that you might be able to incorporate something without it actually being like practice outside of your day job necessarily, but just like a way that you could incorporate it in as part of your regular routine, right?
Yep.
That's one thing that's cool about pair programming. You know, as much as it's exhausting, you do shorten that feedback loop a whole lot, right? You can kind of get that litmus check immediately, like if you're going some way off in left field.
Yeah, and you're encoding that success. Like one example I kind of like there is like sometimes I'll do something like, oh, I think there's a better way to do this, but I don't want to stop what I'm doing right now and look it up. So I'll just kind of do what I can now, and I'll take a little to do it later. And then guess what happens later? All right, now I'm busy. I got to get this checked in so I don't do it. And if someone had been there that was more familiar with that area and was able to say, hey, someone else did that like last week, like go check it out right here, then we could have encoded the success. And the next time that problem comes up, I'm more likely to remember that good thing rather than the bad thing that I used to work around it.
Right.
So I got a couple tips here for just kind of mentoring. We'll go through quick. One thing I thought was interesting is that they really emphasize making a plan up front and sticking to it. I think that a lot of times they would see, at least when working with teachers, that a lot of times the practices would actually devolve very early on into talking about the practice itself, particularly about how the practice is like not like real world or not like whatever, or just it kind of devolved and lost focus.
Wait a minute. Is this mentoring tips from the point of view of being mentored or mentoring tips from the point of view of mentoring others?
Mentoring others.
Okay. So if I'm going to mentor others, I need to make a plan and stick to it.
Definitely the onus, like the entire perspective in the Practice Perfect at least, has always been from the perspective of the teacher. I don't think they really talk too much about like what it meant to be kind of a good pupil other than going out and finding a good teacher. Call your shots. I thought that was really interesting. Like they gave some cool examples there where like they're pairing two people up, like a good salesman and a bad salesman. And then they go into a meeting and they come out of it, and the new salesperson thinks like, oh man, this didn't go very well because, you know, we got a deal, but it was real rough and it was rocky. It was really awkward. And the other salesman is like, I didn't think we were going to get that at all. This is fantastic. This opens a lot of doors. And because the new salesperson didn't understand what the kind of problems and situation they were in ahead of time, they didn't understand like the goal, and they didn't even understand that a good thing was happening when it was.
But
So
how
I
is
think it's
that?
important.
What does that mean for call your shots, though? I think I'm missing the point.
You want to be upfront with your kind of your pupil or the person you're pairing with. But like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a simple login form. It's going to be really robust, and it's going to use this technology.
Okay, so make sure that the person that you're mentoring understands what the goal is. So not just you made your goal. Yeah. Okay. So I'm with you.
Right.
So that's what you were talking about from the sales perspective. Is
Right.
that person didn't understand what his goal was going in, so he didn't know that his outcome was going a particular way. I got it.
Yeah, you can think like an example there where you got two coders, they're pair programming. First one says like, come on, we're going to write a login page. They get together, they write the little page. And at the end of the day, that new programmer might think, well, we used this, kind of technology stack because that's the best for writing login pages. Well, really, they use that technology because that's the one that most coders have experience with, or because there was a simple example that they had to look at. So they may not understand the reasons behind why things are done. And you can see how they might go and they think like, well, they made this login page in C# because C# is the best. So now they go to start a new greenfield project. They're like, well, C# is the best. And what happened was that decision was made because, for very application specific reasons. But because that wasn't discussed up front and the exercise wasn't planned out ahead of time for specific reasons, like here's why we're working on this thing and here's why we're working on it in this way, then the person left with the wrong interpretation.
Okay. Makes sense.
We talked about encoding success. The sooner you can get that success, the sooner you can correct that bad activity, the better. And that also goes along with the idea of the get a whistle, which is a really cute chapter. It's basically like the coach blows the whistle as soon as that bad habit happens. Like you're playing basketball and you got a bad habit of shooting with one arm, right? Blow that whistle immediately as soon as you start to see that happen, because you want to get them to not do the bad thing. You want them to always do the good thing. You want to encode that success.
Cool.
Another one of my favorites was actually coming up with a name. And they kind of, I think, had a harder time coming up with justifications for this in the book because it's kind of not as common to us as programmers who have, lots of experience with abstraction. But I think when we talk about design patterns and I say, hey, let's implement a factory here, or we need an observer here, those are really powerful terms because I say the word observer and you're already thinking about 10 examples where you've used observers and you've seen, and I don't have to try and describe what I mean by eye notifications and throwing updates and whatnot. So just that one word observer is really powerful to you and it lets us communicate at a higher level. And so later when I'm looking at a pull request or something, I could say, why didn't you use an observer here? And it kicks off this whole world of knowledge in your brain and thinking and discussion. Whereas if we don't have that term observer, we're going to spend half that conversation trying to get on the same page about what we're talking about because it's an advanced topic. So just modularity, good abstraction. Same with solid. If you send me a pull request thing, say hey, where's the S? This is you've got your dependencies intermingled here. I can use these shorter words and you know what it means if I say your dependencies are intermingled here, or you've got your logic kind of your presentation and your query logic mixed together. Because you've been doing this sort of stuff a long time. You've been having discussions like that for a long time. So it's great that I can give you 5 words that mean a lot to you.
So it's more about coming up with a common vocabulary.
Expanding building a ubiquitous language.
I was just about to say ubiquitous language.
Yep. And don't forget to measure and then don't forget to do it. It's kind of funny to think you can get the TDD book, work all weekend on it, get back to your day job, and then never do it again.
Yeah, I mean, along with all these mentoring tips, the thing that stands out is, Joe didn't share it in this, but he actually had a slide in his presentation deck that actually showed that one of the most effective ways to learn is to teach. It's one of the reasons why we did this podcast. I mean, when we first talked about this, the way to sharpen and enhance your skills is to force yourself to really dig into it, right? And so going into all the topics that we have over time and continuing to do that, it forces us to go read books. It forces us to do more practices. It forces us to take a look at our code and say, oh, what could we have done different here, right? And we've learned a lot doing this podcast. I'm sure that we have. And so even if you don't think you're as far along as where you need to be to mentor somebody, don't let that stop you, right? If you're an intermediate developer by some random measure out there, find a junior dev and see if you can mentor them, right? Or if you're a junior developer, find your little cousin who's 12 and try and make some IoT type thing, right? Mentoring can happen at every stage of the game and it will make you better along the way.
Absolutely. So we'll have a bunch of links to the various books we talked about. I actually want to pitch codingblocks.net/practice where I've written a bunch of essays and also gathered just a lot of different links to various studies and whatnot. And if you actually drill into those articles, you'll see there's just a ton of links in there. as well as my slides for the talk.
Cool.
Yep. So with that, let's head into Alan's favorite portion of the show. It's the tip of the week.
Yeah, baby. And we've got a new participant here, so you're going to get some bonus tips.
Yeah,
Just
so
yeah.
we'll let our guest go first. I'm sorry, Alan. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No,
Excuse
you're
me.
good.
All right, cool. So I have a couple here. I'll start with probably the most interesting one first. So there's this app called Krypton. And basically what it is you can sort of use your SSH keys securely by only having them on your mobile device. And then you can SSH from any machine without having to have your private keys stored on that machine. So it's especially good for environments where I work, where I move from machine to machine all the time. And I don't really want my privates to be on there where somebody could be, committing stuff and looking like it's me. It's really cool. It comes with like a nice CLI application that you use to like pair your phone to that particular machine for that period of time. And then whenever you get ready to do anything that involves your keys, it sends you like a push notification saying, hey, I see somebody trying to like pull from GitHub using your credentials. Is this okay? And you basically tap, yep, I approve. This is cool. And then everything works as normal. So that was pretty sweet.
Dude, that's awesome.
Yeah, it is.
It's really cool. And bonus tip, it's written in Go, I'm pretty sure. The back end is.
And you got to like the pricing on it too.
Oh,
The
Christy
core-
Whiskey?
The core version of it is free, $0 forever, it says. Now, I guess there's going to be something if you're trying to do this at a team level, they're, I guess, looking at how they might charge for that. It looks like they don't say a price yet. They just say that it's like early access.
Dude, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, but it's awesome. Yeah,
That's
you
great.
should totally try it. Second tip is SourceGraph, which is another platform, I think, which most of their tooling is written in Go as well. They have an awesome Chrome plugin for if you want like sort of like an IDE type of experience when you're browsing through GitHub looking at open source repos and trying to navigate. Sometimes those repositories can be really large, especially for like big projects like Kubernetes. But a lot of times I use it to like figure out different idioms and patterns that big projects like that use to find some of those best practices and things I can incorporate into my own code. So the SourceGraph plugin for GitHub is also really awesome.
Man, we talked about something similar to that one though, but what was it called?
Yeah, I'm going to go look that up right now. That came from Kritner.
Yeah, I've seen something very similar to this before. And that's we were talking about it earlier. That's both,
it was. I'm sorry.
No, both killer tools.
Yeah, it was a plugin specifically targeted towards GitHub that would basically put like a file explorer view on it, right? Make it.
Yeah, I've got it at work, but I don't remember the name. Oh, Octotree.
Oh yeah.
So it looks really similar where it gives you kind of the file browser on the left. And I really liked it actually because it made it really easy for me to get back to like readmes and stuff. So I could hop into the code and then like quickly get back out to the top level.
Yeah, the cool part about SourceGraph though is in addition to like the directory, it also gives you like very smart code navigation stuff like jump to definition and really sweet code search, like far and beyond the stuff that you get on GitHub by default.
That's beautiful. That is awesome.
So like I could look for show me places where they use this particular package or this thing from this package. Like it's really cool.
Very
Excellent.
nice.
Excellent. All right, Joe, what you got?
Me? I just want to mention our buddy Will Gant from Complete Developer Podcast. I just listened to him on another show, which is called the Junior Dev Podcast. And he was talking about what it's like and why it's beneficial to learn other programming languages. And this podcast is kind of aimed at kind of more junior developers in there. So if you're looking for your first job or in those first couple of years, this is a fantastic show to listen to. And so I just wanted to make sure to give them a shout out if you're not already listening to it.
Awesome.
All right, and I'm going to have a couple links in here for Unpackage. So this is basically how you can use a CDN for everything on NPM. So you can use it to quickly and easily load any file from any package using a URL, including you can specify the version as well that you want. So it's pretty cool. I'm going to include links to a GitHub has examples of how you can use this thing, as well as the link to Unpackage itself. It's unpackage.com, but it's only one vowel.
Well,
So-
hold on. Yeah, not unpackaged.com.
Yeah, unpkg.com.
There, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you would pronounce it Unpackage, right?
Yes.
So
That's really cool. It reminds me of this thing in Go called Go Package In that does a similar thing It's almost like a proxy that like fronts all the NPM packages. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's super cool. I mean, if you haven't already used it, it makes it really easy to just bring it in. Although I do kind of question too, like, okay, is that a bad habit though to do it that way instead of like bringing it in as an NPM package that I can then save the environment and
Yeah, it seems like so. Yeah, hard to say.
Does it get listed in package JSON like a normal dependency? Just with like a different URL?
No, not in the ones that, at least not in the ones I've seen. Now, maybe I need to dig into this thing more, but in the times where I've used it and where I've seen other people use it, it's like baked into like a script tag in your HTML file.
Like think if you're bringing in Bootstrap or something like that, and you want to pull it, and you want to pull it from a CDN. Yeah,
Gotcha.
Yeah,
cool.
Did you have another one?
Nope, that was it.
Oh, okay.
Wow, I didn't realize. Way to put me on spot, Alan. I got to come up with a,
you said a couple
second,
of links.
third one.
Well,
yeah, there's 2 links to the 2 things. Now I got to come up with another one off the spot. So thanks.
There are 2 links. All right,
no pressure.
So here we go. All right, so this one's awesome. So in the previous episode, we had some sort of, I think it was our survey. Somebody was saying something about stand-up desk. I can't remember exactly what the conversation was now. But like a lot of people had stand-up desks at their job. We were like, wow, that's crazy. Companies are spending a lot of money on stand-up desks, which shocked us. So go ahead.
Stack Overflow survey results.
Yeah. Okay. That's what it was. Okay. It wasn't our survey.
Oh, I thought it was going to be, because there was another conversation where we specifically had like how to spend, like $2,500. And that was kind of like what started the whole stand-up desk conversation, I think, maybe, at least from us.
In the past.
You had specifically, one of your things that you had recommended was
the
made by Veridesk.
Yeah. So here's one that's really cool. This is a complete desk that we'll have a link to on Amazon that Richard wrote us directly in email and shared with us. And this particular stand-up desk, I asked him because one of the problems with cheap sit stand desks is typically when they're fully extended in the stand position, they're wobbly as heck. Like you can touch it and you just watch it like swing back and forth. And he said that this one was not, and they've bought several of them. This particular desk is called the Titan Fitness A2, and it's actually motorized. It's got a top, and it's got the motorized legs for $312. That's cheap, guys. You typically can't even buy a cheap desk for $312, let alone one that's got a motorized stand on it. So,
and that's free shipping.
And free shipping. It's ridiculous, man. And if you sign up for the Amazon Prime Rewards Visa card, you can get whatever.
Hey, can I slip a quick tip in here?
You may.
All right. One thing I want to mention about those automatic ones with the you can kind of hit it up and it'll go up and you can walk out of the room and get a drink while it's rising or falling. Don't go get a drink because sometimes you might have something hanging off your desk that ends up kind of getting stuck in the wall and dragging a nice little line up there. So,
dude,
I punched a pretty nice little hole in my wall there. Something just got jammed just the right way and just.
I will say, like, typically if you have things like I have computers on my desk, right, or mounted to my desk. I actually have the things that screw up to the desk that hold them so that when the thing's going up and down, it doesn't snag cables and all that. Although it doesn't fix the thing when you just got something hanging off your desk charging your phone or something. But, yeah, interesting.
I was expecting, and maybe, you guys were going to go here too. I really expected that Joe was going to tell us a sad story about it, like how he broke his new phone or something because he hit the up button on it and walked away, and then the phone just happened to fall and land right on the metal leg or something of the desk or something.
No, he put a hole in the wall. It was better.
I mean, who cares about a hole in the wall, right, man? That's okay.
The interest.
Are you kidding me? My phone's been cracked for years.
Oh man, that's ridiculous. I can't talk about that. I will say, so the cool part is it looks like this thing has, a foot and a half of travel almost. It goes from 28 inches tall from the top up to 47. So pretty good thing here. So at any rate, very good tip. Thank you, Richard, for sending that one in. And then the other one I got from the same podcast episode on MS Dev Show where they were talking about blockchain. This was really cool. Didn't even know it existed. And I found out something else new about it. So a lot of times when you're dealing with cloud services, whether it be AWS or Azure or any of them, typically there's a command line client for interacting with these things. And they're way more powerful and you can script them out and you can do all kinds of stuff, right? So Azure has the CLI, but if you don't want to have to install that thing and bring down all the dependencies, you can go to shell.azure.com. And if you've got your Azure account set up, you can go in here and you can actually interact with this thing directly. So you can spin up Azure services or do whatever you need to do, all from an integrated environment that's a command line on the web. Really cool stuff. The other thing, though, too, that I found out is this is also baked in the Azure portal. So if you go to azure.com/portal and you log into your shell there, up at the top, you'll see like a little bell. You'll have your search box, then a bell, and then you'll see this command prompt type thing. If you click that, it'll actually give you the shell down at the bottom. So there's two ways you can access it. You can either do it from directly within your portal, or you can go to shell.azure.com. So again, really cool stuff. I mean, it does all the stuff that the command line does, but again, you don't have to bring down all your dependencies and everything. It's all right there. So it's kind of a nice way. Oh, and the cool part is, so if you decide that you're going to do shell.azure, which if any of you guys just clicked on it and went to it, it was probably like, hey, you need to set up a block storage account for it or a blob storage, right? So the thing is, you can actually create your scripts because it's going to set you up a storage section. And when you save your scripts, they'll actually be there available so that when you come back next time, you can get directly to your scripts and pick up where you left off. So thanks, Carl. I stole your tip. I really enjoyed this one. So, there you go.
Great. Well, huge thanks to Will for coming out tonight. I know I speak for all of us to say we've got a ton of respect for Will. Like, Will, I wish you could be like my full-time guardian angel, just sitting on my shoulder, keeping me from making bad code and otherwise mistakes. So I really appreciate you coming out here and talking to us.
I'm just glad y'all had me on, man. I'm such a huge fan. Like, this is such an honor to come and do this with y'all, and I missed y'all. I'm trying to like turn this into like a bro love fest. But.
Nah, I mean, we had so many conversations when we all worked together. Like, we would just have awesome conversations about tabs versus spaces or formatting or, the most performant way to do things or breaking things apart. Like, it was always some good geek out things.
Nougat versus Maven.
Oh man, there's no, look, Maven wins. And that's painful for me to say as somebody who's a C# guy. But yeah, man, thank you very much for coming out. It's not a short drive for you, but we do appreciate it.
Yep, and we hope that you, dear listener, also enjoyed this. And you can find Will on Twitter at I am Will Madison. Follow him there.
Yep.
I will retweet a lot of Go stuff, so you'll learn something interesting about Go probably if you follow me.
Awesome.
And so with that, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app. Be sure to leave us a review if you haven't already by visiting www.codingblocks.net/review.
And while you're up there, go ahead and check out our show notes, which are said to be some of the best around. Our examples, discussions, and more.
Send your feedbacks, questions, and rants to the Slack channel, codingblocks.slack.com, and follow us on Twitter too, @codingblocks, or head over to codingblocks.net and you can find social links at the top of the page.